The water came without warning. One moment the Powder River held its banks. The next it didn't. A wall of brown moved through the valley like something that had been waiting a long time to stop waiting. 5 men, a shrinking bar of gravel, no bridge, no way across. Every horse on the ranch refused the water. Every horse but one. She was the smallest animal in the remuda, torn ear, crooked tail. The horse they gave to the man nobody wanted because they figured the worst horse belonged with the man who had nothing left to lose. They were wrong about the horse. They were wrong about the man. And in the next 10 minutes, on a river that was swallowing everything in its path, both of them were going to prove it. The flood came without an announcement. That was the thing, nobody told you about the high country. You learned it or you didn't, and the difference between those two outcomes was not always survivable. The mountains held their water the way a man holds a grudge quiet for a long time, then all at once, without mercy and without warning, releasing everything they had stored through the long dead months of winter into the narrow cuts and coulees that fed every river south of the Beartooths. By the time the sound reached the valley, by the time the low grinding roar moved down the canyon walls and spread itself across the benchland like something alive and purposeful, it was already too late to make different choices. The choices had been made hours ago. The consequences were simply catching up. Eli Bowen heard it before he saw it. He was sitting his horse at the eastern edge of the Callaway Range, watching the cottonwoods along the river bend shiver in a wind that had no business blowing from that direction in mid-morning, and the sound reached him the way distant thunder sometimes did, felt in the chest before it registered in the ears. River felt it too. The small dun mare beneath him had been twitching her good ear toward the north for the better part of an hour, the torn left ear lying flat in a way that had nothing to do with irritation and everything to do with something Eli did not yet have a name for. He would find the name for it later. Standing on a shrinking bar of gravel with the water rising around them both, with the last light draining out of a Montana sky, gone the color of a bad bruise, he would understand exactly what she had been telling him since morning. But that was later. That was the reckoning. This was still the moment before. He watched the river come apart. The near bank held for 3 seconds after the sound arrived, and then it simply ceased to exist. A length of earth 20 feet wide and 6 feet deep folded into the current like something made of paper, taking 2 cottonwoods with it, their root masses spinning in the brown surge like the wheels of some terrible machine. The water that replaced the bank was not the Powder River that Eli had forded twice that week. It was something that had borrowed the river's bed and filled it with the weight of everything the mountains had been carrying since October snowmelt and topsoil and timber, and the accumulated pressure of a winter that had refused until now to fully release its claim on the land. Gus Dalton and 4 men were on the wrong side of it. River did not wait for Eli to make a decision. She had already moved 12 steps back from the bank before he understood what was happening, picking her way up the loose shale of the low rise behind them with the careful, unhurried precision of an animal that had been in water like this before and knew exactly how much margin existed between standing ground and none. Eli let her choose the route. He had learned that much in 3 months not to fight her when the ground was the question, because she was reading information through her feet that he would never have access to regardless of how long he stood in one place and looked. From the rise he could see the gravel bar. He could see the 5 men standing on it. He could see the channel between them and the eastern bank, and he could see what the channel was carrying. And he understood that no horse he had watched go into that water today, not the big gray that Harriet kept for rough country, not the black quarter horse that Gus rode on good days, no horse currently in the Callaway remuda was going to cross that channel willingly. He had watched 2 of them try. He had watched what happened when the current reached their chests. He had seen Harriet stop the 3rd attempt with a word and a raised hand, because Harriet Callaway had not survived 30 years of Montana ranching by asking animals to exceed what their nature permitted and calling the results of that request success. He had 3 months on this land. He had a horse that smelled wrong to everyone who looked at her and was correct about the ground every time she stopped. And he had a debt he had not yet articulated to anyone, including himself, the specific, unearnable debt of a man who had been pulled back from the edge of not caring whether he survived, pulled back not by optimism or by any decision of his own making, but by a small dun mare with a ruined ear who had stood in the early light outside a chugging stall and waited for him with a patience that shamed everything he thought he knew about loss. He unwrapped River's bit and slid it free from her mouth. Harriet Calloway was watching from the bank. That was 3 months after Eli Bowen rode through the gate of the Calloway place, with one saddlebag that wasn't full, and a horse he'd borrowed from the livery in Miles City, because he no longer owned the kind of property that came with livestock attached. The gate was simple 2 pine posts, and a crossrail, no ornament, no name burned into a sign above it, the kind of entrance that told you everything you needed to know about the woman who owned it. She was not in the business of announcing herself. The ranch announced her well enough through other means. The condition of the fencing, the way the buildings sat on the land, level and practical, oriented to the prevailing wind. The horses in the near pasture, which were not beautiful horses in the way that show animals were beautiful, but were horses that looked as though they could do what you asked of them, and do it again tomorrow without requiring a conversation about it. Eli had been riding for 11 days. Not continuously, but without destination, which was its own kind of continuous, the kind where stopping somewhere was never quite stopping because nowhere had the specific gravity of a place that expected you to return. He had sold the Wyoming property in February, 2 months after the ground froze hard enough to accept a grave without difficulty, and he had carried the money and the grief in approximately equal weight through the balance of that winter without knowing what either one was supposed to become. Pete Morrow had found him in the Gold Strike Saloon in Miles City on a Tuesday evening. Pete, who had been with the Calloway outfit for 16 years, and who had a way of observing a room when he entered it that had nothing to do with self-preservation and everything to do with genuine curiosity about people, the kind of old-fashioned interest in strangers that was becoming rarer every year as the territory got more settled and people got more suspicious of one another. Pete had sat down across the table without asking and ordered 2 whiskeys and said, "You've got the look of a man who could use work that requires his whole attention." Eli hadn't answered right away. He'd been sitting with his hat on the table and his hands wrapped around a glass that had been empty for 20 minutes, looking at something that wasn't in the room. "What kind of work?" he said finally. Pete had a face like weathered limestone, cut through with lines that were as much from squinting into distance as from age. And his eyes when he smiled were the eyes of a man who found the world consistently more interesting than it had any obligation to be. Cattle outfit, south of here. Owners named Calloway. Harriet Calloway. She needs hands for spring and she doesn't make promises she can't keep, which is rarer than it sounds. He drank his whiskey. She won't tell you it'll be permanent if she doesn't know it will. She won't pretend to be something she's not to get you to sign on. And she works as hard as any man on the property, which I find respectable. Eli had ridden south the following morning. The interview, if it could be called that, lasted 4 minutes. Harriet Calloway came down from the porch of the main house in a wool skirt and a heavy blouse with the cuffs rolled back, wearing boots that had been resoled at least twice and a canvas apron that had seen better days and a great deal of honest labor since. She was 52 years old and moved like a younger woman. Not because she was vain about it, but because 30 years of physical work had built a body that was still fundamentally reliable. Her hair was dark with threads of silver, and she wore it pinned without ceremony. She looked at Eli the way you looked at a piece of equipment you were considering purchasing, not unkindly, but without sentimentality. He told her what he could do: fence work, cattle handling, shoeing if the horse wasn't complicated, basic wound treatment for livestock, reading weather well enough to be useful in open country. He did not tell her about the tack room in the Wyoming house, or the yellow curtains his wife had hung in the kitchen window, because she said the room needed something that caught the light. He did not tell her about the 7 months when everything had been pointed at a future that had a specific shape, and then the shape had simply ceased to exist overnight, leaving him in a house that fit him the way a coat fits a man who has lost a significant amount of weight, still technically wearable, but wrong in every dimension. Harriet had listened without interrupting. "Every person on this property works," she said, "including me. Nobody gets consideration for a difficult history because difficult history is not a skill." She paused. "Can you start Monday?" he said. "I already started." "I'm listening, aren't I?" She looked at him for 2 seconds longer than was strictly necessary. Then she turned toward the barn. "Gus will show you around." Gus Dalton was the kind of foreman who had been good at his job for so long that he had confused competence with correctness, which is a mistake that large competence and long tenure make almost inevitable. He had run cattle outfits across 4 territories and had the crow's feet and the square posture of a man who had spent most of his adult life outdoors making decisions under pressure. His flannel shirt was always tucked and his mustache was always trimmed, and his moccasin-toed boots had the kind of high, undercut heel that was useful for catching a stirrup fast, and he wore them with the unconscious confidence of a man for whom the tools of his work had become extensions of himself. He shook Eli's hand with the grip of someone who still believed you could read a man in 4 seconds of handshake and said, "How long you been working cattle?" 7 years. Gus walked him through the south barn, not looking at him, checking stall latches and water buckets as he went. "We run about 800 head through the summer. 3 bunkhouses. Good crew. I don't carry passengers and I don't make exceptions for men who can't keep pace." He stopped at the far end of the barn, at a stall set apart from the others by perhaps 10 feet of open space, not from deliberate isolation, but because the other horses had arranged themselves in the adjacent stalls in a way that left a natural gap around this particular animal, the way water moves around a stone. "You'll need a horse for the roundup." The mare was standing with one hip dropped, resting, in the particular attitude of an animal that has learned to conserve energy wherever possible without losing awareness. She was small through the shoulder by the standards of the horses around her, with a wide, deep chest and hindquarters that were disproportionately powerful for her overall frame. Her coat was the specific dusty dun of river silt, not the pale gold of a typical dun but something darker, the color of the Powder River on a cloudy morning, and it did not hold a shine cleanly. Though Eli would later notice, this was because she was always acquiring it and losing it, that she was perpetually outside and perpetually moving through country that left its mark. Her left ear was missing perhaps a third of its length, the edge not cleanly healed but ridged with old scar tissue. Her tail grew at a slight angle, the set of it crooked in a way that was not painful and not correctable, simply the result of some old injury to the dock that had healed imperfectly. Along both rear legs, running parallel to the tendons, were 2 faint paired lines of scar tissue, thin, straight, and too evenly spaced to be accidental. Eli saw those scars and did not say anything about them. "Her name is River," Gus said, and there was something in the way he said it flat and final, like a door closing, that suggested the name was the only neutral thing about this particular conversation. She stops. No warning, no provocation, no apparent reason. She's put 2 men on the ground when they tried to push her through it. She's not fast and she's not pretty, and she requires more attention per useful mile than any animal on this property. He unlatched the stall gate and stood aside. She was cheap to acquire and she has not gotten more valuable. Eli looked at River. River was no longer resting the hip. Both ears were moving now, the good right ear tracking Eli directly, the damaged left ear swiveling on its shorter axis towards some sound outside the barn that neither of the men could hear. She was not aggressive. She was not frightened. She was doing what Eli would come to recognize as her characteristic mode of engagement with the world. She was attending. Fully, carefully, with the complete investment of her senses. "What do you want me to do with her?" Eli asked. "Learn her limits," Gus said, which was not the same as learn her. And Eli understood the difference even if Gus did not or did not anymore. A man without a horse isn't much use in this country. This is what's available. The cowboys who had drifted toward the barn entrance during this exchange, there were 4 of them. Broad-shouldered men in worn flannel and canvas trousers and battered mule-ear boots, doing that particular thing that people do when they're watching something they expect to provide entertainment, visibly recalibrated their expectations when Eli did not climb into the saddle. Instead, he pulled the stall gate open wider, walked past River without reaching for her, and sat down on the floor at the far end of the stall with his back against the wall and his knees up and his hat in his lap. River turned to face him. She did not approach. She was not a horse that approached immediately. She stood and looked at him, with the frank, unblinking assessment of an animal that has learned to be careful about what it gives its trust to, and Eli looked back at her with the specific patience of a man who has recently had the experience of waiting for something that never came, and who has discovered in the aftermath of that waiting that he is apparently still capable of sitting still. One of the cowboys Eli would later learn his name was Chess, that he was 24, and from Colorado, and had a wide, guileless face that made him look younger, said from the barn entrance, "Usually takes about 30 seconds before she pins him to the wall." Nobody answered him. Nobody felt the need. Eli sat in the stall for 40 minutes. At the 20-minute mark, River walked to within 6 feet of him and stopped. At the 30-minute mark, she extended her nose toward his boot and breathed in and then raised her head and worked her nostrils at something she could smell from the top of him. At the 38-minute mark, he set a piece of dried apple on the stall floor 12 inches in front of his boot and did not move otherwise. River looked at the apple. She looked at Eli. She looked at the floor around the apple, specifically at the floor around the apple, moving her gaze across it in a slow, deliberate sweep, and then she took 2 steps forward and ate it. Pete Morrow, who had been standing in the barn doorway since the 30-minute mark without Eli knowing it, turned around and walked back toward the tack room, wearing an expression that the 2 cowboys near him could not interpret, but would remember later, when it became relevant. The first week went the way first weeks on a new outfit always go. You learn the land by covering it, you learn the crew by working beside them, and you learn your position in the hierarchy by which tasks get assigned to you, without explanation, and which ones you have to ask about. Eli hauled water and mended fence and cleaned stalls and was up before the crew. Cook had the fire going, not because he was performing industry, but because he had not slept past 4 in the morning since February and had stopped expecting that to change. He did every task without complaint and without conversation beyond what the task required, which some of the crew read as arrogance, and some read as grief, and one of them, Pete, read correctly as a man who was conserving himself for something he hadn't found yet. He spent an hour with River every morning before the day's work began. Not riding her, not training her in any formal sense. He brushed her. He cleaned her feet, discovering in the process that her hooves were significantly wider than those of any horse her size, that he had worked with, wide and hard-soled with low heels. The specific conformation of a hoof that has adapted to distribute weight across soft ground rather than drive down through it. He refit her bridle, moving the bit 2 inches left from its established position, so that the pressure points fell away from the damaged side of her mouth rather than directly against it. And the first morning he did this, she held herself very still while he worked. Not with the stillness of tolerance, but with the stillness of something paying close attention to a he had not anticipated and was trying to understand. On the 5th morning, she was standing at the stall gate when he arrived. He didn't make anything of it out loud. He simply unlatched the gate and went in and picked up the brush. And she positioned herself for it the way she had learned he preferred, and they went through the morning ritual in the particular comfortable silence that develops between 2 living things when they have decided, without formal negotiation, that they will extend each other the benefit of the doubt. Gus watched this from across the barn with an expression that was not quite skepticism and not quite dismissal, something between them, the look of a man who has a theory and is waiting for the evidence to confirm it, certain enough in the theory that the wait is not anxious. The first ride outside the corral happened on the 8th day. Eli saddled River without spurs, had not brought spurs onto this property, a choice Gus had registered with one pulled down corner of his mouth, but not commented on, and led her around the corral twice before mounting. She was stiff the first circuit, holding herself with the wariness of an animal that has learned to anticipate pain from certain specific human behaviors. By the second circuit, something in her back had released, some long-held bracing. He mounted and sat still and asked her forward with the inside of his calves. No heel, and she walked. She did not walk beautifully. Her trot was rough enough that you felt every footfall, and her stride was short enough that she could not match pace with the other horses when they were moving fast across open ground. But she never wasted a step. Every foot landed where she had looked first. There was an economy to her movement that you didn't see in horses that had been pushed and kicked and spur-argued into going where they were pointed regardless of what they felt beneath them, a deliberateness that read, at first, as slowness, but was in fact something else entirely. She was processing. She was reading the ground the way a careful man reads a contract, looking for the clause that's going to cost him later if he misses it now. They were half a mile from the corral, following a game trail along the base of a long, low ridge, when River stopped. The ground looked fine. The trail was dry, the grass on either side showing no sign of unusual softness. The sky above them clear in the way of a high country spring morning before the clouds built from the west. Eli did not kick her. He sat and felt the quality of her stillness. It was not the stillness of stubbornness, not the locked-up, bristling refusal of a horse that has decided against a specific rider. It was a listening stillness, Both ears were forward, and her nostrils were moving, and she was looking at a particular patch of ground 12 feet ahead of the trail, with the fixed, focused attention of something that has detected a discrepancy between what a thing looks like and what a thing is. He dismounted. He picked up a heavy stick from the edge of the trail and walked 6 feet forward and pressed the end of it into the ground at the left edge of the dry-looking path. The stick went in 2 inches and stopped normal. He moved the stick 3 feet right, to the spot River had been staring at, and pressed it into the ground that looked identical to the ground beside it, and the stick went in past his wrist before it stopped, into mud that was held in suspension below a sun-baked crust of earth thin enough to fool a man, and not quite thin enough to fool a horse. A horse's leg, coming down hard with the weight of horse and rider, would have punched through that crust. The fall would have been fast and bad. Eli stood with the stick, still in the ground, and looked back at River, who was watching him with both ears forward, and an expression that was not triumphant because horses do not experience triumph in the way that people do, but that was recognizable as something in the neighborhood of patient vindication. He led her around the soft spot and remounted, and they continued along the ridge. That evening he mentioned it to Gus in the most neutral language he could manage the soft spot on the north trail, the crust over the mud pocket, just in case any of the men were using that route with the heavier horses. Gus listened and said, "Any horse can get lucky once." He walked away. Eli did not argue because arguing with Gus Dalton was not a productive use of energy, and because, more importantly, the point was not to win the argument. The point was that he had walked around the mud pocket. The point was that River had stopped. Pete found him at the fence line the following afternoon, where Eli was replacing a rotted post with a new one, working methodically through the slow, satisfying labor of setting something right that had gone wrong. The old stable hand leaned on the adjacent post and watched him work for a while without introduction, and then said she was from a bottomland outfit east of the Powder, before she came here. Spring of '86. He let that settle. The water came up in 3 hours. Nobody was expecting it in April because the winter hadn't been unusual. But the mountains had a lot of snow and it went fast. He was quiet for a moment. She was the only horse they recovered standing. The hands found her on a gravel ridge with the water up to her belly. She'd been there 3 days. Eli set the post and tamped the earth around it. What happened to the rest of the herd? Pete was quiet for long enough that the silence had a shape. The Coulter place had a marsh pasture south of the main field. Good grass in normal years. They'd moved the horses there for the new growth. He picked up a piece of bark from the ground and turned it in his fingers. Horses in a panic will run away from water. Then the water cuts off the retreat and they run again. And then there's nowhere left to run. He dropped the bark. River didn't panic. She found high ground and she stayed there. Eli straightened and looked toward the pasture where River was grazing in the late afternoon light, the dun color of her coat catching the gold at the edge of the day. Pete. He was still looking at the pasture, the scars on her hind legs. Pete was quiet for 3 seconds. Patterson. He was on the crew 2 years ago. She stopped at a creek crossing during a thunderstorm and he stopped, began again. He had the idea that the appropriate response to a horse that wouldn't move was persuade it with the kind of persuasion that leaves a mark. He looked at his boots. Gus saw it. Another pause. Gus kept Patterson on through the fall. Eli didn't say anything, I told Harriet. Pete's voice was even, the voice of a man delivering a recorded fact. She said Gus ran the crew, and Gus needed the hands and Patterson was going to be gone before winter anyway, which was all true. The pause that followed was longer than the others. I still told her. I want you to know that I told her. That night, Eli lay in the bunk with the wool blanket pulled to his chest and the sound of 7 men breathing around him in the dark, and he thought about Patterson and about Gus and about the specific economy of a working ranch, where every decision has to be weighed against what the operation needs to survive, and sometimes that calculus produces outcomes that nobody particularly wanted, but that everyone can find a reason for. He understood it. He had made similar calculations himself, or watched people he respected make them, and he did not think Harriet Calloway was a woman who had made that call carelessly or without cost to herself. He understood all of it. He still lay awake for 2 hours. The days shaped themselves into a pattern that he came to rely on with the specific gratitude of a man who has recently had the experience of days with no pattern at all, the loose, unstructured grief days that had no anchor and no obligation and therefore no reason to end, Days where the difference between morning and afternoon was only the direction of the light. Here there was always something to move toward. The fence that needed the third post, or the water tank that was silting up at the south end, or the young steer with the infected foot that he spent 4 days treating until the infection cleared and the animal walked out of the chute without favoring it. Useful work, the kind that left visible evidence of itself. He had always worked. He did not know how to be a man who didn't. And there was River every morning waiting at the gate. He was learning her grammar. Not the grammar of commands. She would respond to leg pressure and weight shifts and the softest rein contact. The grammar of the riding ring, but the grammar of her attention. The specific vocabulary of her pauses. He learned that when she stopped and both ears went forward, she had found something directly in front of them. When the right ear tracked forward and the left angled back, she was processing two things at once. When she pulled left against a loose rein, she was not being difficult, but was suggesting an alternative route, and the 2 times he had ignored the suggestion in those early weeks he had encountered. Within 60 feet, a soft bank that would have taken them both down, or a section of dry creek bed that was less dry than it looked. He stopped ignoring the suggestions. Harriet saw more than she let on. She had built an operation in country that ate less attentive outfits alive, and she had done it by having a very clear eye for what was actually happening around her, as opposed to what she had been told was happening, or what she had assumed must be happening. One morning in the 3rd week of Eli's time on the ranch, she rode out to where he was working a section of fence along the north pasture, and sat her horse and watched him work for a while, without announcing she was there, which would not have been possible with any other member of her crew, because they all made noise unconsciously, and Harriet Calloway moved across the land, the way weather moved, present and purposeful, and without the need for announcement. "Pete says you've been adjusting her bit," she said. Eli finished driving a staple before he answered. Pressure point was wrong for the ear. She's been running with it positioned for an undamaged horse. Everything on the left side was compensation. Harriet was quiet. She was looking at River, who was ground-tied 20 feet away and was standing with both ears up and her nose slightly elevated, reading the air from the north. "What do you make of her?" Harriet asked. He considered his answer the way he did most things, without haste, with genuine interest in getting it right. "She notices when the ground is lying," he said. "Most horses will trust what it looks like. She trusts what it sounds like when she steps on it, or what it feels like from a foot away." He drove another staple. "That's not something you teach. That's something you either have or you don't." Harriet looked at him for a moment in the measuring way she had. "Gus says she's not reliable." "Gus is measuring reliable wrong," Eli said, and then realized he'd said it out loud and looked up. Harriet's expression had not changed. He said, "Reliable ought to mean does what it does consistently. She's consistent. She stops at ground that's going to give way every time. That's reliable. What it's not is convenient." Harriet was quiet for long enough that a hawk crossed the sky to the south of them and curved away. "See that you don't get her killed proving a point," she said, and turned her horse and rode back toward the main buildings. He watched her go and then looked at River, who had turned her head to follow the sound of the departing hoofbeats, and then, as they faded, redirected her attention back to whatever she had been reading in the air from the north. That had been 3 weeks before the morning the color of the sky changed. He noticed it first at 5:30, stepping out of the bunkhouse in the gray-blue pre-dawn that preceded every Montana morning regardless of season, pulling his canvas jacket over his flannel shirt and settling his hat and stopping on the step because something in the quality of the light from the north was wrong. Not wrong in a way he could have explained to someone who hadn't spent years in open country, learning to read what the sky said before. It said it in language you could argue with, not a cloud formation or a specific color that had a name in the almanac, but wrong in the way that a thing is wrong when it is doing something slightly different from what it has always done. The horizon to the north had the particular flat, yellowish luminescence of light coming through suspended particles, dust, or moisture, or both, and the wind that should have been from the west at that hour was instead out of the north and carrying a smell, water. Not the mineral smell of snowmelt in the air above the mountains, which he knew, but the deeper smell of disturbed earth and moving water, river smell, the smell of a living thing that had expanded beyond its usual dimensions. He stood on the step for 2 minutes. Then he crossed to the barn. River was already at the gate. Not standing with the hip cocked in rest, not idling, but standing with all four legs square and her weight distributed evenly, both ears, the whole one and the torn one, pointing north, her nostrils doing the constant slow work of sorting air into information. She was sweating lightly along the neck, which meant she had been standing like this for some time, and the air in the barn was cool enough that the sweat was visible. He put his hand flat against her neck and held it there. Her pulse was elevated. He stood in the barn in the early dark with his hand on the neck of a horse that had already arrived at a conclusion he was only beginning to approach, and he understood with the specific, unwelcome clarity of a man who has been paying attention to the right things long enough to know what they're telling him, that the day was going to go badly if the next few hours went the way he could see they were going to go, because Gus Dalton would read the sky and read the river and make the calculation that the operation needed, and would dismiss the things that couldn't be entered in the ledger, and the things that couldn't be entered in the ledger were, on this particular morning, the only things that actually mattered. He found Pete in the small room at the end of the feed barn, where Pete kept a cot and a lantern and a habit of rising before anyone else, because 62 years had shrunk his sleep requirements to something that astonished younger men. The old stable hand was already awake, sitting on the edge of the cot with his boots in his hands, and he looked up when Eli pushed the door, and his expression did not change because it was already set in the expression of a man who has been waiting for someone to come through a door. "The river," Eli said. Pete put on his boots. "Yes." "How fast?" "Faster than Gus is going to believe," Pete said, "until it's too late to make it useful." He stood. "You should tell him anyway. What does that accomplish?" Pete looked at him with the ancient, level patience of someone who has made peace with the arithmetic of situations where doing the right thing and achieving the desired outcome are not always the same calculation. "It means you told him," Pete said. "It means when the thing happens, you are not a man who saw it coming and stayed quiet." He picked up his hat from the peg beside the door. "That matters even when it doesn't change anything. Maybe especially then," Eli told Gus. Gus was at the breakfast fire with his coffee and his mustache and his 20 years of experience that had hardened, without his noticing, from wisdom into certainty, and he listened to Eli's account of the sky color and the wind direction and river's behavior with the expression of a man assembling a rebuttal while the other person is still speaking. When Eli finished, Gus said, "Horses smell a lot of things. Men who haven't been here long think they know what the horse smells." He drank his coffee. "Sky looks clear to me. We moved the cattle today." Eli had one more thing to say and he said it, "At least the high route." Gus set down his cup. "The high route costs us half a day and a hard push at the end of it. We're not losing half a day because you've decided your horse is some kind of oracle." He was not unkind in the way he said it, which was almost worse, because the lack of unkindness meant he genuinely believed what he was saying, and genuinely believed Eli was operating from inexperience and enthusiasm rather than from observation. "Get your horse." Eli got his horse. River came out of the stall with the square-weight stance she'd had since before dawn, and when he cinched the saddle, she stood for it, without moving, but her ears never stopped working the air from the north. He pulled on his gloves, heavy leather, worn smooth at the rein fingers, and settled his duster over the flannel and adjusted his hat and stood for a moment with his hand on River's neck, not calming her because she was not agitated, just being in contact with something he trusted, in the minutes before he would have to go into the day, and trust it to do what it was going to do, regardless of what he thought about it. He mounted. River moved out of the barn without being asked, already pointed south, toward the cattle, toward the work that was going to happen no matter what color the sky was. Above them from the north the light was still wrong. Still flat and yellow-gray in a way that had no good explanation. Still building toward a thing that the sky knew, and the river knew, and the small dun mare with the torn ear knew, and that the men riding out through the gate of the Calloway place in the spring morning were going to understand, only when the understanding was no longer a matter of choice. River's good ear tracked the work ahead of her. Her damaged ear lay low and to the north. She already knew how this morning ended. She had survived one just like it. The cattle knew before the men did. Not in any way that Gus Dalton would have accepted as evidence, not in any way that could be written in a ledger or argued in a foreman's meeting, but in the collective unease that moved through a herd the way a rumor moves through a small town from animal to animal, invisible and total. changing the behavior of the group before any individual member could have articulated what was wrong. Eli noticed it first in the way the lead steers kept drifting south when the push required them to hold east. Not running, not spooked, just repeatedly, quietly, persistently choosing south, the way water chooses downhill, not from decision but from nature, from something older than decision. He kept pulling them back east, River moving with him in the smooth, economical way she had developed over the past weeks, and the steers would comply for 50 yards and then begin the slow drift again, their heavy heads swinging toward the south with a patient, unargued insistence. River's ear never came down. The left one, the torn one that could not fully track but could still receive. It had been angled north and slightly back since before dawn, since the stall in the gray before light, and it stayed there through the whole of the morning's work, no matter what was happening in front of them, no matter where the cattle moved, or what Eli asked of her. She gave him her right ear, her complete right side attention for the work. The left side of her was somewhere else entirely, listening to the north, listening to the thing in the mountains that had not yet arrived in the valley, but that was in the process of becoming unavoidable. The crew had covered 2 miles by mid-morning. 7 men in flannel and canvas and worn leather, moving a mixed herd of 200 across the south benchland toward the river crossing, with the sky above them holding the specific deep blue of a Montana spring day that has not yet decided what it intends to become. Gus rode point in his black hat and his long duster, the heavy quarter horse beneath him moving, with the confident, ground-eating stride of an animal that had spent years being asked to do exactly this, and had no reason to doubt that it would continue indefinitely. Frank Wills worked the left flank in his customary position, a broad-shouldered man of 38 in a canvas jacket gone gray at the elbows, his horse reading the cattle well, his rope coiled on the saddle horn and never needed because he had the specific gift of positioning himself so that strays never became strays in the first place. Chess from Colorado worked the right with 2 other hands whose names Eli had learned, but whose faces he was still assembling into the complete picture of who they were away from the work. Pete was not riding today. Pete had a hip that argued with him in cold spring weather, and Harriet had assigned him to the barn work without making a point of it, which was her way. She never announced the accommodations she made for the people who had given years to the outfit. She simply made them and moved on, and anyone who noticed understood that noticing was the appropriate response and not commentary. Eli worked the right drag and rear, the position Gus always gave the newest man, the position that was technically the least skilled and most physical riding behind the herd, eating its dust, pushing the stragglers, managing the calves that fell back from their mothers without the benefit of seeing what was happening at the front. He had worked this position on 3 outfits before this one, and knew that the correct response to being given it was to work it better than anyone had in recent memory, and wait, and so he did. River made the drag work that no other horse on the crew could have done quite the same way. In the ordinary push across open ground, she was slower than the horses around her, a fact that Chess had noted aloud twice in the first week of their working together, and had stopped noting after the second time, when Eli had not responded, and the comment had therefore produced nothing. But in broken country, in the creek crossings, and the patches of rough ground where the benchland dropped away in small erosion cuts, River was something else. Her wide hooves spread weight across uncertain ground, the way a snowshoe spreads it across soft snow, and she changed direction with a quick, decisive pivot of her hind quarters that belied the stocky, unimpressive appearance of her overall build. 3 times that morning, a calf had broken for the willow thickets along a shallow drainage, and 3 times River had cut the angle before Eli had fully committed to the direction, turning the calf back without a rope and without the prolonged chase that would have exhausted both horses and made the rest of the day harder. Frank Wills pulled alongside after the 3rd one. He rode with his weight back and easy, the way of a man who has sat a horse so long that the posture no longer requires thought. He looked at River without looking at Eli and said nothing for 20 yards, and then, "She doesn't wait for you to decide." Eli watched a steer drift left and brought River over without kicking, the inside calf doing the asking, and the steer turned back. "No," he said. "She doesn't." Frank nodded slowly. "That's either the best thing in a cow horse or the worst," he said, "depending on what the rider knows how to do with it." He drifted back to his flank position and the conversation was finished, but Eli carried it for the next hour, because Frank was not a man who said things without meaning them. and he had not specified which category River fell into in his estimation. Which was, Eli understood the point. Gus called the halt at the river crossing at 10:30. The Powder River here was a different proposition than the section north of the ranch, where the crossing used during ordinary work was shallow and broad with a gravel bottom that had been reliable for so long that the approach trail was worn a foot deep on each side from decades of hooves. This crossing was the alternate narrower, with a steeper approach on the west bank and a better gravel base on the crossing itself, the option Harriet had specified when she'd issued her standing order about the timber bridge. The water was running at what Eli estimated to be 1.5 feet above its spring normal. Still crossable. Not comfortable, but crossable for a confident horse with a confident rider, and the cattle would follow once the horses were through. The first 2 riders went in without ceremony. Their horses moved into the current with the resigned forward momentum of animals that trust their riders more than their own instincts, and have learned through years of repetition that the crossing will be unpleasant and survivable, which is an education that produces compliance without conviction. The water came up to the horses' bellies, then to the lower edge of the riders' boots. Both men leaned forward slightly in the automatic adjustment of experienced river crossers, letting the horses find their footing. The current pushed, the horses compensated, and they emerged on the east bank darker from the knees down and no worse otherwise. Gus turned in his saddle and made the gesture that meant bring the cattle. River stopped at the water's edge. Not at the edge as Eli understood it, the visible line, where solid ground met moving water but 10 feet before it, at a point in the approach that looked like solid ground and felt, through the reins, like solid ground and was, as far as Eli could determine from where he sat, solid ground. She planted all 4 feet and lowered her head, and her nostrils went to work, pulling the air off the surface of the river in the specific, concentrated way she had when she was reading rather than simply smelling. From 50 feet back, Gus watched this and his jaw set. Eli did not kick her. He did not dig his heel in, or reach for the strap end of his rein, or any of the various methods that a rider who was in a hurry or was afraid of appearing uncertain would reach for immediately. He sat still and let her work. The cattle bunched behind him, confused by the halt, lowing with the low-grade irritation of animals that have been moving, and are now not moving and cannot see a reason. Gus brought his horse alongside, the big quarter horse shouldering past the rear of the herd with the authority of an animal that had never been told it might be wrong. "Move her," Gus said. His voice was not raised, he did not shout. He said it the way a man says a thing when he considers it self-evident. "Give her a minute," Eli said. The quality of the silence that followed was the specific silence of a confrontation that has not yet decided whether it will escalate. Gus had 20 years of running crews and the authority that came with Harriet Calloway's trust, and Eli Bowen had been on this property for less than a month, and the social arithmetic of those 2 facts was not subtle. Several of the cowboys had drifted to positions where they could watch without appearing to watch. River walked, not forward, left. She moved left along the bank at a deliberate, unhurried walk, pulling gently against the rein with the persistence of an animal that has somewhere specific to be and is not asking permission, but is at least making the effort to communicate direction. Eli let her go. He heard Gus make a short sound behind him, something between a word and a dismissal, and he chose not to interpret it. River walked 40 yards north along the bank, moving parallel to the current, stopping twice to test the air, and then she stopped at a section of bank that looked, to Eli's eye, no different from the section they had left, slightly different gravel composition perhaps. The stones here a fraction smaller and more uniform, the near edge of the water curving in a slight concavity that produced a small backwater almost too minor to notice. She lowered her nose to within 6 inches of the ground and held it there for 5 full seconds. Then she lifted her head and looked across the river. She waited. Eli pressed with his left calf, the softest ask he could make, and River stepped into the water. The current here was marginally slower in that first yard from the bank, something that the physics of the slight concave curve in the bank produced by deflecting the main channel 6 inches outward, and River found the seam between the bank edge water and the main flow, and moved along it in a diagonal that kept them in the quieter water longer than the straight-across route would have. When she crossed the seam and entered the full current, the water came up to her belly and no higher, and the riverbed beneath her feet was flat-packed gravel, without the soft spots that the original crossing had. Eli felt the difference through the saddle, the clean, even pressure of good footing rather than the subtle give and recover of a bottom that was inconsistent. They emerged on the east bank. Eli turned river to look back. He could see, from the east bank angle, what the approach to the original crossing looked like from a perspective that had not been available to anyone standing on the west bank about to enter. The near bank at the established crossing had a darker look to the soil that was visible now, the specific dark brown of wet earth that had saturated below the surface, held there by a clay lens that kept the water from draining. Beneath the dry-looking surface crust, the near bank of the original crossing was holding water that had seeped in from the river at high flow, and a horse's hoof coming down hard on it would punch through into mud that would grip and hold in the worst possible moment. Gus crossed with the main herd at the original crossing, 300 feet south, watching Eli on the far bank, with an expression that was unreadable from that distance. The first cattle followed the horses through with the usual pushing and complaint. Frank Wills guided his horse through the deeper water, with the competence of long practice. The herd came across in clusters, the calves bunched tight against their mothers, the water roiling brown and cold around moving legs. Nobody went down. Eli watched the eastern bank soil at the original crossing as the herd emerged, and he saw what he had expected to see. The near edge of the bank, under the repeated impact of 200 head of cattle crossing in sequence, was beginning to show the dark wetness from below, the crust compressing and releasing moisture. One more crossing, maybe two, and it would give. The cattle were lighter per hoof than a horse under a rider, and they were spread across a wider area. And so the damage was distributed, but it was accumulating. Gus brought his horse through the tail end of the herd and came up beside Eli on the east bank. He looked at the original crossing. He looked at the bank. He looked at river. He was quiet for long enough that the lead cattle had moved 40 yards into the east bank grass before he said anything. The far side has a soft edge, he said. Not a question, yes, said. Gus was quiet again. Around them, the sounds of the working cattle and the calling of the hands who were settling the herd on the new grass made a familiar din that was almost domestic in its ordinariness, the sounds of a working day that was, so far, going as planned. The horse knew before you crossed, he said. Eli did not answer, because the question wasn't really a question and the answer wasn't really needed. Gus turned his horse north and rode toward the herd without another word. It was not acknowledgement. It was not gratitude, and it was not the beginning of a changed opinion. Those things did not happen in Gus Dalton in any rapid way, had probably not happened in him rapidly in 20 years, but it was the absence of dismissal, and with Gus that was its own form of information. Frank Wills, who had seen the whole exchange from 15 feet away, looked at Eli with an expression that said, "He won't forget. He also will not thank you for it." Welcome to the specific mathematics of men who know they've been wrong, but have no architecture for saying so. They pushed the herd east through the rest of the morning. The ground on this side of the river was better. For it the grass was higher, and the cattle moved with the purpose of animals that have found what they were looking for. The specific contentment of livestock on new spring grass that expressed itself in the quality of their movement, a reduced restlessness, a willingness to be pushed in the chosen direction without constant pressure from the rear. River settled into the work with the same quiet competence she brought to everything on solid, well-read ground. Eli felt the difference in her when the ground was right, a looseness through her back, a longer swing in her stride, the physical expression of an animal that is not currently allocating any attention to the question of whether the earth beneath it is trustworthy. The late morning passed with the texture of good working hours that had weight and purpose, and the satisfying physical cost of genuine labor. The sun climbed and the shadows shortened, and the smell of the east bank grass came up rich and clean in the warming air. Then Eli looked north. He had been looking north intermittently all morning, the habit of it having established itself before he was aware of forming a habit, the way the eye finds a loose thread in cloth and keeps returning to it. The northern horizon had the same yellowish luminescence it had held at dawn, but it was no longer stationary. The flat light was moving. Not in the way clouds move pushing across the sky, in identifiable shapes, but in the way weather moves when it is still too far away to see its form, but close enough that its presence changes the quality of everything between it and where you're standing. The air was not warmer. The air was in fact slightly cooler than it had been an hour ago, which was wrong for midday in May, and wrong for the prevailing wind pattern, and wrong in the way that a face is wrong when a person is trying to look neutral and has something they are working very hard not to say. River's ear had not moved, still north. Still low on the left side, receiving whatever the air from the mountains was carrying, cataloging it with the patient thoroughness of an instrument that does not get tired or distracted or convince itself that the reading must be wrong because it would be inconvenient if it were right. Eli had stopped doubting the ear. He had stopped doubting it the morning she sweat in the cold barn, stopped doubting it in the way that a man who has been twice shown something reliable stops requiring additional demonstrations. He trusted it now the way he trusted the feel of good footing, through a saddle, not with conscious decision but with the deeper trust of a body that has incorporated new information and adjusted its assumptions accordingly. He brought River alongside Gus on the next circuit. Gus was eating a biscuit from his coat pocket, riding with the reins looped over the horn in the way of a man completely at home in the saddle, reading the herd ahead of him with the automatic competence of long practice. He glanced at Eli and did not stop chewing. "North sky," Eli said. "It's moved since this morning." Gus looked north, chewing. He looked for 4 seconds. "Spring weather in the mountains," he said. "Doesn't always come to the valley." River's been running her left ear north since before dawn. Gus finished the biscuit. He brushed crumbs from the front of his duster with the back of his glove. "I've seen horses act wrong about weather for 30 years, he said. "Half the time they're right. Half the time they're smelling a dead rabbit or a coyote 2 miles off." He looked at Eli with the expression of a man who is not unkind and is also not going to change. "We have a day's work to finish." "Sky looks clear to us," Pete said. "Pete has opinions about the sky that I've been hearing since before you were working cattle." He said it without edge, which was worse than if he'd been sharp about it. Pete's not wrong when he's wrong about the river either. Half the time. The cattle need to be home before dark. Eli held it for 3 seconds and then let it go, because he had said what he needed to say, and saying it twice would accomplish nothing, except to entrench the position he was trying to move. He had learned this not here, not from Pete or from Harriet, but from the 7 years before this, from the particular education of running his own place, and being wrong often enough to know that the way you were wrong mattered as much as the fact of being wrong. He pulled River back to the drag position. The afternoon gathered itself. They had the herd 3/4 of the way across the east benchland when the smell of the air changed, and Eli caught it immediately. Caught it the way you catch a sound that doesn't belong in a room you know well, not by focusing on it but by the way the familiar pattern suddenly has a gap where it shouldn't. The mineral sweetness of disturbed soil and moving water, not the benign smell of the river they'd crossed that morning, but something rawer and more urgent, something that carried in it the geological depth of mountains being rearranged. He looked at River. Her entire body was different, not the twitching attention she'd been giving the north all day. This was something else, the standing still of an animal that has stopped allocating resources to anything except the information coming in. Every muscle group that was not currently required for standing was quiet. Her nostrils were working in long, slow pulls. Her eyes were wide but not rolling, not the white-rimmed panic of a frightened horse, but the wide alertness of one that has arrived at a conclusion and is now simply waiting for the conclusion to manifest in terms that the humans around it can perceive. Eli turned his horse north. He could not see anything. The sky above the benchland was still clear in the way that skies stay clear, even when the thing that will change them is already in motion. But he could see that the line of cottonwoods along the river bend to the north, visible over the low rise at the edge of the benchland, was moving in a way that the current wind did not account for, a shuddering in the upper branches that meant something was pushing from the other side, from the riverside. He stood in his stirrups and looked. The cottonwoods bent, and then the sound arrived. It was not thunder. Eli had heard thunder in every configuration that Montana weather produced, and this was none of them. This was a sound that came from the ground as much as from the air, a low, rolling grind that had the specific frequency of large objects moving against each other, timber and stone, and compressed water meeting the resistance of a river channel too narrow for what was being put through it. The sound of a mountain deciding to rearrange itself and being largely indifferent to what was in the way. Frank Wills was 30 yards to Eli's left and heard it at the same moment, and their eyes found each other across that distance in the instant before either of them moved, and the look that passed between them was the look of two men, who have heard that specific sound before and know what it means, and know they have perhaps 45 seconds to be somewhere other than where they are. Eli drove River into the flank of the nearest steer and shouted across to Ches, "High ground now. Hard." Ches opened his mouth to ask something, and Eli did not wait for the question. He was already pushing, driving into the left side of the herd, River moving with the kind of decisiveness she showed when she was certain, no hesitation, no holding back, the full investment of her strength and quickness into turning the animals that were closest to the north and east. The cattle that had been docile for hours suddenly had an argument. Steers that had been content to drift east planted their feet against the new pressure and threw their heads, and River got into each one of them without flinching, shouldering, pressing, turning. From the north, from the river bend, there was a sound that was not exactly a sound, more a change in the air pressure, a thickening of the atmosphere that preceded the water by perhaps 30 seconds, a physical announcement. Gus Dalton understood it in that moment. Eli saw it happen, saw the information enter Gus's body through some deep channel that bypassed the foreman's practiced certainty and went straight to the part of him that had learned what real danger felt like before he ever developed opinions about it. Gus turned his horse north and looked at the cottonwoods, and then looked at the sky, and then made the decision that all his 20 years of experience could make very fast once it accepted the data it had been refusing all morning. He turned and bellowed at the crew to pull west and up. Too late for all of them. The water came around the north bend of the benchland, not as a wave, nothing so clean or organized as a wave, but as a mass. A brown, churning, indifferent mass of water and suspended material, carrying in it the evidence of everything it had collected on its way down through the mountain coulees, sections of bank, root masses, the trunks of trees that had been undermined and toppled into the current upstream, a tangle of old fencing wire, and beneath all of it the invisible force of 10,000 tons of snowmelt, finding the lowest point in any landscape it entered. The near bank of the Powder gave way in the first 3 seconds. Eli was already up the low rise with River when it happened, pulling a steer by the tail rope that he'd somehow gotten attached in the confusion, hauling the animal up the grade while River dug into the slope with the powerful quarters that nobody on this outfit had yet seen deployed at full capacity. Below and to his left, the cattle that had been closest to the river bank went into the water, with the helpless, terrible momentum of animals that had no frame of reference for what was happening to them. Above and to his right, Chess and Two Hands had gotten a section of the herd to higher ground, and were holding them there, with the frantic energy of men who have just survived something and are not yet able to believe it. Frank Wills was in the water. Not swept away, his horse was swimming, strongly, the animal's head up and his nose pointed toward the high ground to the east, with the instinctive navigation of a horse that knows where safety is, and is going toward it regardless of what the water wants. Frank was riding with his feet out of the stirrups and his weight back, the correct position. The position of a man who has been in rivers before and knows that you do not fight the water, you negotiate with it, you find the angle that lets it carry you toward your destination rather than away from it. He made the east bank 30 yards downstream from where he'd gone in, his horse scrambling up the cut bank with the desperate explosive effort of all 4 legs engaged at once. Gus was not on the east bank. Gus and 4 men were on a gravel bar, the same gravel bar that existed along the east side of the river channel in ordinary times. The bar that had been accessible from either bank when the river was within its banks, it was now an island. The main flood channel had cut through the low point of the east bench, behind it, creating a secondary channel between the gravel bar and the high ground to the east, and that secondary channel was running fast with the brown overflow from the main river, and it was deep enough and fast enough that it was not a thing you walked across. Eli counted the men on the bar. 5. Gus. 2 Hands, whose names were Reg and Calvin. A young cowboy barely grown named Weston, who was the newest on the outfit after Eli himself, and Frank. Not Frank. Frank was on the east bank. He was off his horse and sitting on the ground, holding his left leg in both hands and not putting any weight on it, and the angle of the lower leg below the knee was wrong, in a way that did not require medical training to understand. 4 men and Gus on the gravel bar. Frank on the east bank with a broken leg. The gravel bar was perhaps 70 yards long and 30 wide at its widest point, but the water on both sides was rising, and the bar was not rising with it. River stood on the high ground above the east bank where Eli had brought her, and she was looking at the bar. Not the way a horse looks at a thing that frightens it. The way she looked at the ground before a crossing with the specific, focused attention of an animal that is taking in information and processing it toward a conclusion. Her torn left ear lay flat against her neck. Her good right ear was forward and tracking. Her nostrils moved. Eli dismounted and stood beside her and looked at the channel between the high ground and the bar. The water in that channel was moving faster than the section of the main river she had crossed that morning, carrying more debris, less predictable, the kind of moving water that made its decisions without reference to what you wanted or what you thought you deserved. He looked at the width of it. He looked at what it was carrying. He looked at the men on the bar and at the water still rising around their boots and at the cottonwood tree in the center of the bar that they were beginning to move toward, its bent trunk now the highest point available to them. Harriet Calloway arrived on the high bank above them. He did not hear her approach because the water was louder than horses now, louder than everything. She simply appeared at his right side, on her working horse, in her canvas apron that she had not taken off since breakfast, looking at the channel and then at the bar and then at the men on it, with the specific economy of attention that belonged to someone assessing a situation rather than reacting to it. She sent one of the hands who had made it to high ground riding for town at a full run for rope, for men, for the doctor. She looked at the distance to the bar and the height of the water and back again. Then she looked at River. Eli had already been looking at River. The mare had moved 6 feet left along the high bank, toward the upstream end of the channel, and was standing with her nose out over the water, pulling the air off the surface in slow, deliberate drafts. She took 2 steps back from the edge, 1 step left. Then she moved 3 steps forward to the rim of the bank at a different point, a point that was perhaps 2 feet upstream from where Eli had been standing, and lowered her head and blew a slow breath out across the water. Harriet watched. "She's looking for something," she said. "Not a question. She's been right every time," Eli said, and he heard himself say it, and knew it was not an argument but a statement of accumulated evidence, the kind of statement that needed no defense, because it had already been tested and had already produced results. Harriet was quiet for 4 seconds. Around them, on the high ground behind, several cowboys were pulling rope from their saddlebags and calling to each other in the raised, urgent voices of men making the first-order plans, the plans that did not yet know what the situation required, but were starting to organize material in case. On the bar, Gus was holding his hat on with one hand and looking at the east bank and at the channel between them, with the expression of a man who has spent 20 years making confident assessments and has just encountered one that he cannot manage from the available options. Harriet looked at Eli. "That animal is not built for this water. I know. You know what you're asking her." Eli did know. He knew it the way you know a thing that you have already decided about, where the knowing is not the point, the deciding is. River was not a river horse by size or by strength. She was a horse that had survived 3 days in flood water 9 years ago, not because she was powerful enough to fight it, but because she was intelligent enough not to. That was the distinction that mattered. Not strength, not speed. Something older and more specific to her. Something that had been branded into her by the experience of finding herself alone in water with no option except to read it correctly. He had one thing to offer, and it was not force. "She's done it before," he said, "in worse conditions by herself." He looked at the channel, at the men on the bar, at the gravel they were standing on that was narrowing as the water claimed its edges. "She just has to do it once. I'll be on her." Harriet looked at him for the length of 3 breaths. Then she said, "Shorten your stirrups and check your knots yourself." She dismounted and pulled the longest rope from her saddlebag with the quick, economical movements of a woman who had done every physical task on this property at some point and was not performing industry, only working. "I'll hold the east end." Eli shortened the stirrups. He checked the knot that tied the rope to his saddle horn, checked it again, pulled on it with his full weight. He looked at his gloves. The left one had a split at the index finger that had been there for a week. He pulled the left glove off and reversed it, so the split was on the outside of the hand. Minor, he put it back on. He walked to River. She was still at the bank's edge, still reading the surface of the water below the point she had selected. He put his hand flat on the side of her neck, below the ear that could still hear, and stood there for a moment that was not sentimental and was not prayer, but was in the neighborhood of both the moment of acknowledgement that passes between two living things before they do something that cannot be undone. He reached up and began to work the bit free from her mouth. She held still for it. The metal came out clean, and he hooked it over his saddle horn, leaving her bridleless, with only the hackamore and the rope and the loose rein that she could disregard completely if she needed to, if the swimming required her jaw and her neck to move without restriction. He wrapped his left hand once through her mane, not a hold he could keep if she went under, but a contact, a point of connection between them in the water. He mounted. She moved to the bank without being asked. She did not go in fast. Fast was not the point, and she appeared to understand this with the same clarity that she understood the difference between ground that would hold and ground that wouldn't. She stepped to the edge and lowered her head and tested the first foot of water with her left fore, feeling the bottom, feeling the current speed at the depth of her hoof, and then she stepped fully to the bank's edge and stood. On the bar, Gus had seen what was happening and was directing the other men to the upstream end of the bar, away from the cottonwood toward the point where a rope coming from the east could reach the highest ground remaining. Harriet called from behind Eli. He looked back. She was standing with the rope's east end wrapped 3 times around her saddle horn, and her horse planted square, and her face had the expression of a woman who has made a decision and is now entirely past the moment of making it and into the moment of carrying it out, and she said, "The horse knows the water better than you do. Let her work." He turned forward. He pressed his calf the softest pressure. The ask, not the demand, and River stepped off the bank. The water took them immediately, not violently but completely, rising to River's belly in the first step and covering it in the second, and then she was swimming, and the current was everything it had looked like from the bank, fast and full of intention, carrying the weight of the mountains against the slight forward movement of a small horse in search of the slow water she had identified from above. For 2 seconds, for 3, the current pushed them downstream, and they were moving in a direction that was not toward the bar and not toward safety, and Eli kept his hand in her mane and kept the rein loose and did not pull her head around, did not try to override the direction she had chosen. She had chosen downstream. She had chosen it deliberately. She was angling with the current rather than against it, moving at an angle that used the river's force rather than fighting it, heading downstream and toward the bar rather than directly across, burning less of her strength in the fight and more in the navigation, which was precisely what a horse that had survived 3 days alone in floodwater would understand about rivers that a man sitting on one in the middle of one might not. The current swept them south along the edge of the main channel, and then they were behind the bar. The water on the downstream side of the gravel bar was quieter, not calm, but calmer, the hydraulic shelter of the bar deflecting the main force of the current and leaving a seam of slower water along its south face. River found the seam and her hooves touched gravel, and she walked up out of the water onto the downstream end of the bar in the manner of an animal that has arrived somewhere it intended to arrive. The men on the bar were silent. Gus looked at River, looked at her the way a man looks at something that has required him to revise a fundamental assumption, not with pleasure and not with resentment, but with the slow, private, effortful mechanics of genuine revision. Eli uncoiled the rope from his horn and held the end out. "High as you can tie it," he said. "Above where the water is, not where it was." Gus took the rope. Eli looked at the bar shrinking beneath them, at the water still rising on both sides, at the 5 men who needed to cross a channel that was still running hard. He looked at River. She was standing with all 4 feet square on what remained of the bar, blowing the river out of her nostrils, her sides heaving with the sustained effort of the swim. She was tired. For the first time today she was genuinely tired, not the alert, working tired of a long day, but the deeper tired of an animal that has given something significant. He put his hand on her neck and felt her pulse coming down. On the east bank, Harriet had wrapped the rope around the cottonwood she'd backed her horse to, creating a fixed line between the bar and the bank, and the first of the hands on the bar, young Weston. The lightest was already moving toward the water, and the bar was still shrinking, and the light, without anyone having noticed the afternoon pass, was beginning to angle toward evening, and River's torn ear, the left one, the one that had been pointing north since before sunrise, finally came forward, as if whatever it had been listening for had arrived, and could now be acknowledged, and the listening portion of the day was finished. The working portion, however, was not. The rope held. That was the first fact of the rescue and it was the only fact that mattered in the seconds after Gus tied it to the bent cottonwood at the upstream end of the bar, because everything that followed depended on it holding, and it did. The rawhide line Harriet had brought from the main ranch, the long one. The one she kept coiled on a specific peg in the tack room, because it was the heaviest and most reliable piece of rope on the property, and she had never been able to articulate why she kept reaching for it in difficult situations, except that it had never failed her stretch taut between the cottonwood on the bar and the larger cottonwood on the east bank, where Harriet's horse was planted, and the current pushed against the middle of it, and the middle bowed downstream, but the ends held and the line stayed above the water, and that was enough. Enough for a plan, not enough for comfort. Weston went first because he was lightest, and because nobody suggested it, and he simply moved to the water's edge and looked at Gus. And Gus looked at the rope and then at Weston and gave a single nod, which was the entirety of the briefing. Weston was 20 years old and wore a canvas jacket 2 sizes too large that had belonged to an older brother, and his mule-ear boots were already soaked through from the rising water on the bar. He waded in to his waist, gripped the rope with both gloved hands and moved, hand over hand. The current hit him sideways the moment he left the bar's shelter, and his legs swept downstream and he was horizontal for 20 feet, hauling himself along the rope while the water tried to separate him from it, and he made the east bank by the time the watching men had collectively exhaled once. He came up the bank cut on hands and knees, and stood on the solid ground of the east bench, and turned around and looked back at the bar, and said something that the noise of the water swallowed entirely, but that read, in the shapes his mouth made, like a word that a young man uses when he has just crossed something that could have killed him and has not. Reg went next then. Both men were larger than Weston, and the current took them harder, pushed them farther downstream during the crossing. And by the time Calvin pulled himself up the east bank, the rope was angled so far from perpendicular that the geometry of it was becoming a problem. Each additional crossing stretched the downstream bow further, and there was a point where the bow would become severe enough that the force of the current on the rope would exceed what the 2 anchor points could hold. Eli understood this without calculating it, understood it from the feel of the rope where it was tied to his saddle horn, and from the way he could see the rawhide beginning to show the strain in the slight fraying of its outer twist. 2 men left on the bar, Gus and Frank Wills, who was not on the bar. Frank was on the east bank with his leg at the wrong angle, sitting against the base of the larger cottonwood with his face, the gray-white, of a man who is managing pain by concentrating on something else, and has been concentrating for long enough that the concentration is beginning to cost him more than the pain. He had dragged himself away from the bank's edge after coming out of the water, so that he was not in anyone's way, which was the first thing Frank Wills would have done, and which was entirely consistent with who he was, the kind of man who would not inconvenience other people with his emergency if he could possibly avoid it. Gus was standing at the upstream end of the bar in water that now covered his boots and reached his ankles when it surged. He had taken off his duster at some point during the rescue operations and hung it on the highest branch of the cottonwood behind him, and his flannel shirt was dark with river spray and the particular damp that comes from being close to cold water in cold air for an extended period. He was watching Eli. He had been watching Eli for most of the rescue, watching in the way that a man watches something he is trying to understand, with the full concentration of an intelligence that is no longer working from its assumptions, because its assumptions have been thoroughly and publicly overturned. Eli looked at the rope, looked at the bow in it, looked at the distance from the bar to the east bank, which was 70 yards at the straightest line, and perhaps 90 the way the current would carry you. The rope, at its current angle of deflection, was not going to be long enough to reach straight across if it moved further downstream. And it was going to move further downstream the moment a man Gus's size and weight put his hands on it and let the current take him horizontal. The solution came to Eli, not as a sudden idea, but as a recognition, the way solutions come when you have been working a problem long enough that your mind has already found the answer and is simply waiting for your attention to catch up. He turned to Harriet on the east bank. "We need the trough." The words crossed the water at full voice, because the water required full voice now, required the kind of projection that feels like shouting but isn't quite, the specific volume of men working outdoors in conditions that were eating sound. Harriet looked at him. She looked at the rope. She looked at Gus on the bar. She understood what he meant in less than 3 seconds, because Harriet Calloway had been running a working ranch for 30 years, and a working ranch contained a feed trough, and a feed trough was, in its essential geometry, a shallow rectangular box that could float if it was empty and sealed, and pushed on a rope across a channel of moving water. She turned to Chess, who was standing behind her horse in the particular way of someone who very much wants to be useful and has not yet identified what useful looks like in this situation. And she said, "The south barn. Long feed trough, the pine one, not the split one. Get 2 men and bring it now." Chess moved. He moved fast, the way young men move, when they are given a clear task by someone whose authority they don't question. And the 2 hands who had made it to high ground went with him, and they were running across the benchland toward the ranch in the specific, urgent way of people for whom the situation has crystallized from confusing emergency into definite mission. Gus called from the bar. His voice carried a quality that Eli had not heard in it before, not fear, because Gus Dalton was not a man who expressed fear in any direct way, but something adjacent, a thinning of the professional certainty that was his habitual register. "The bar's at half," he called. "Water's coming up on the south side now." Eli could see it. The south side of the bar, which had been the dry sud 30 minutes ago, was now a series of shallow puddles as the rising water from the secondary channel found the low points in the gravel. The bar was not exactly sinking. Gravel bars do not sink, but the water was finding and claiming every portion of it that was not at the highest elevation. And the highest elevation on the bar was the cottonwood's root mass, which had perhaps 4 feet of vertical relief above the current water level on the south side. And the water was still rising. There was perhaps 90 minutes of useful light left in the day. Eli had not looked at the light directly until that moment, because looking at it had not been relevant to any decision he was making. But it was relevant now, because if the trough plan failed, or if the trough did not arrive in time, or if the rope gave way during Gus's crossing, then the decision about what happened next would be made in darkness. And decisions made in darkness in flood conditions had a much narrower range of acceptable outcomes. He dismounted. River needed rest. She had been standing on a gravel bar in cold air after an extended swim in floodwater for the better part of an hour, and her coat was still damp along her belly and flanks, and she had given what she had given, and Eli was not going to put her back in the water without giving her every minute of recovery that the situation permitted. He ran his hands along her sides, checking her breathing, which was normal now, the deep, steady respiration of an animal that has returned from exertion and is processing the return. She was alert. Both ears up, the right forward, the torn left tracking. She was watching the water the way she always watched things that required her attention. He left the rope tied to her saddle horn. It was the sturdiest anchor point available to him on this side of the channel, sturdier than the iron stake Harriet had driven into the gravel behind her horse's position on the east bank, because the saddle horn gave and returned with a living animal's movement, rather than holding absolutely rigid against sudden load spikes. And the dynamic anchor was better for a rope under lateral stress from moving water. Pete Morrow appeared on the high bank behind Harriet. Eli had not known Pete was there, and then he was there, which was Pete's way, the way of a man whose presence registered when he chose to make it register and not before. He was on foot, moving with the careful economy of his bad hip, carrying 2 lengths of rope coiled over each shoulder and a look on his face that said he had assessed the situation from the bank above before descending to this level and had arrived at the same conclusion Eli had arrived at, which was that the plan was sound if the equipment arrived in time. Pete came to stand beside Eli. He looked at the rope configuration. He looked at the bow. "You'll need to walk her upstream," he said, nodding at River when Gus goes in. "Keep the anchor point moving upstream to compensate for the bow." Eli had been calculating the same thing. How far? Pete looked at the current, at the angle of the rope, at the width of the channel. He did the arithmetic with his eyes in the way of someone who has done this kind of arithmetic before. Not in flood conditions specifically, but in the related conditions of moving livestock across difficult water, which required the same geometric intuitions. 20 feet, maybe 25. Walk slow and keep the line tight. Eli nodded. Ches and the 2 hands came back across the benchland at a dead run, carrying the pine feed trough between them. It was 6 feet long and 18 inches wide and deep enough to seat a man with his legs extended, a heavy, honest piece of carpentry that had been planed smooth on the inside and left rough on the outside, and had been holding grain and water for the working horses of the Calloway ranch for 11 years. They brought it to the bank edge, and Harriet looked at it and made the immediate practical assessment that it needed to be sealed. The trough had seams at the corners that would leak in moving water, and a leaking trough would fill, and a filled trough would sink. She had thought of this before the trough arrived. She sent one of the hands back for a can of axle grease from the barn, which arrived in 3 minutes, and while they waited she had Chess strip his leather vest and stuff it into the lowest corner of the trough as packing, and the grease went over the seams, and Pete ran his thumbnail along each greased seam, with the practiced pressure of someone who knew how to make a temporary seal hold long enough to serve its purpose. Eli watched this and watched the bar simultaneously. Gus was standing at the cottonwood now, one hand on the bent trunk, his boots in water that came to the top of his instep. He was not moving. He was not agitated. He was waiting with the specific, contained patience of a man who has made the decision that waiting is what the situation requires and has committed to it completely, which was the one quality in Gus Dalton that Eli had never questioned. Whatever Gus decided to do, he did without the leaking uncertainty that made men dangerous in emergencies. He had decided to wait for the trough, and he was waiting for the trough, and the water could do what it was going to do, and Gus would be standing at that cottonwood when the trough arrived. Harriet directed the rigging of the trough. A secondary rope shorter, lighter was tied to each end of the trough, creating a bridle, and the bridle was connected to the main crossing rope with a loop that could slide. The trough would ride the main rope across the channel, guided by men on each end of the secondary line, controlled rather than free-floating, the current pushing against it, but the rope keeping it on the transverse line rather than sending it downstream. It was not elegant. It was the improvisation of people who were working with what they had toward a problem they had not anticipated and had perhaps 40 minutes of remaining light to solve. Frank Wills would go first. This was the obvious decision, and everyone arrived at it simultaneously. Frank could not cross on the rope because he could not use his legs to stabilize against the current, could not do the horizontal, hand-over-hand, feet-swept downstream crossing that the others had managed, because one of his feet was connected to one of his legs by a section of bone that was no longer providing the structural service for which it was designed. Frank would go in the trough, and if the trough worked for Frank, it would work for Gus, and if it didn't work for either of them, then the plan had failed, and they would need a different plan, and the light would be gone before they found one. They lowered the trough into the water from the bar end, Gus and Eli working in coordination, Gus from the bar, Eli leaning over the channel edge with the downstream secondary rope in his hands, both men feeding the trough into the water carefully, keeping it level, not letting the current catch the upstream end and spin it before it was in position. The trough floated. Pete had made the seams hold. It sat in the water low but functional, the greased corners weeping slightly but not catastrophically, riding the current's pressure against the main rope in the attitude of a thing that intends to stay where it is for as long as it needs to. Getting Frank into it was the part nobody had fully worked out. Frank could not stand. He had dragged himself to the downstream end of the bar, which was where the trough was positioned, and he sat with his broken leg extended and his good leg under him, and looked at the trough in the water below the bar's edge, with the expression of a man taking an honest inventory of the gap between where he was and where he needed to be. He was not a small man. He was 38 years old and broad through the chest and shoulders, the product of a working life that had built him into the specific physical type of the working cowboy, lean through the waist, heavy through the hands and arms, built for endurance over strength but not without strength. Moving him into a floating trough on a river in flood without dunking the trough was a problem in applied physics that had exactly one attempt. Gus and Eli lifted him, not gracefully. There was no grace available in the situation, and nobody pretended there was. They got Frank under his arms and lowered him over the bar's edge and into the trough in a motion that was controlled and undignified in equal measure, and Frank did not make a sound during it except at the very end, when his broken leg made contact with the trough's interior wall. And what came out of him then was not a word, but was the physical expression of a man who has been holding a significant amount of pain at a careful distance, and has just had the distance reduced to nothing. He was in the trough. The trough held. It tilted downstream against the rope's constraint. the downstream end riding lower in the water than the upstream end, and Frank gripped both gunwales with his gloved hands, and his face was white but his hands were steady. Pete had the upstream secondary rope on the bar end. Eli had the downstream rope on the east bank end, standing upstream of where the trough sat, managing the angle. Harriet had the main crossing rope on her anchor horse, feeling the load on it, ready to ease or tighten as the crossing required. Gus was in the water to his knees on the bar's edge, steadying the upstream end of the trough. They pushed. The current took the trough the moment Gus released it, and the trough swung downstream, and the main rope caught it, and the downstream secondary rope in Eli's hands came tight, and for 3 seconds the trough was purely at the mercy of forces that were much larger than any of the people trying to manage them. Frank held on. He did not try to stabilize the trough with his body, did not shift his weight, did not interfere with the physics of it. He simply held on with both hands, and kept his broken leg braced against nothing and let the men working the ropes do the work, which was the correct instinct and the specific wisdom of a man who knows the difference between helping and making things worse. The trough moved. It moved downstream and across simultaneously, the current and the rope working against each other, and the result of that working being a diagonal transit covered the channel in something that was not a straight line but was, nonetheless, a line with a destination. Eli walked upstream along the bank with the downstream rope, keeping tension in it, compensating for the current's push the way Pete had told him to, measuring the angle by feel, and the trough came across at 20 feet downstream from its starting point and bumped the east bank with a sound that was not graceful and was the best sound Eli had heard all afternoon. Frank came out of the trough with help from 2 hands on the bank, emerging in the same undignified fashion he'd entered it, and was set against the cottonwood beside his previous position, and he looked at the trough, and looked at the channel it had crossed, and looked at his leg and said, quietly, to nobody in particular, "I'll be damned." The trough went back for Gus. Empty, it sat higher in the water, and the current pushed it harder, and Pete on the bar end had to hold his rope with both hands and lean against the load, and his bad hip was not going to let him do this more than once. The trough reached the bar still intact, and Pete caught it and held it against the bar's edge while the current worked against him. And it was in this moment that the branch arrived. Not a small branch. A section of cottonwood trunk, perhaps 12 feet long and 8 inches in diameter, still carrying several subsidiary branches, moving in the main channel to the north of the bar at a speed that made it a different category of object than the debris that had been moving through all afternoon, not floating, but traveling. Displaced timber from somewhere upstream, moving with the authority of something the river had decided to carry. It came around the upstream end of the bar, and into the channel on the bar's east side, the crossing channel, the channel where the trough and the ropes, and the 5 people managing them, were currently positioned, and it hit the main crossing rope at the midpoint. The rope went under. Not broken, the rawhide was too heavy and too good to break at that contact, but the branch caught it, and the weight of the branch and the force of the current on the branch dragged the rope beneath the surface, and the trough, which was connected to the main rope via the bridle loop, went with it. The downstream end of the trough dipped below the water. The upstream end rose. Pete was thrown forward by the change in load and grabbed the bar's edge with both hands, and held himself out of the water by the specific grip strength of an old man who has spent 60 years using his hands for work, and whose hands are therefore not his weakest part. River leaned back. That was what happened, and it happened before Eli had processed what was occurring with the rope, before he had translated the visual information of the rope going under into the tactical information of what needed to happen next. The saddle horn connected to the main rope's east end pulled forward as the branch's weight drew the rope downstream and down, and River felt the change in load on her saddle, and she set her hindquarters and leaned back against it with the full weight of her hindquarters, and the rope came up, not all the way, but enough. The rope lifted off the branch by 6 inches by 8, held there by River's weight distributed through her haunches and the saddle and the horn, and the branch slipped under it, caught for 1 long second, then released, tumbling downstream and away, and the rope returned to its normal position above the water's surface, and the trough righted itself, and Pete, still gripping the bar's edge, pulled himself back to standing, and looked at River on the east bank with an expression that was not surprise but was the confirmation of a thing he had long suspected. Nobody had told River to do that. Nobody had given the signal or the command, or even made the instinctive sound that sometimes communicates urgency to a working horse. She had felt the load change on the rope that was connected to her saddle, and she had responded to the change the way she responded to everything, by reading what the situation required and providing it without drama or delay. Eli stood on the east bank with the downstream rope still in his hands and looked at her. He had no words for it. Not because he was not a man who found words when he needed them, but because the thing he was looking at did not require words and would not have been improved by them. It was the specific, compressed wonder of watching an animal do something that should not be possible given what you have been told about it. And it was the specific, accumulated recognition of a man who has been watching this particular animal for 3 months, and is no longer surprised by her capacity, but is still, in the presence of each new demonstration of it, stopped in a way that is not quite surprise, and is not quite gratitude, and is something that sits between those two things, and has a weight that neither of them has alone. Gus crossed in the trough. He fit into it with less margin than Frank had, his shoulders nearly at the gunwales, and he rode it with the expression of a man doing something undignified and making the dignified decision not to treat it as such. The crossing was smoother than Frank's. The crew had the system understood now, the rope angles correct, the timing of Eli's upstream walk synchronized with the trough's downstream drift, and Gus came to the east bank in perhaps half the time the whole operation had taken the first time, and he stepped out of the trough into ankle-deep water at the bank's edge and pulled himself up the cut bank with both hands and stood on solid ground. He was the last man off the bar. He stood on the east bank and looked back at it. The cottonwood on the bar was the only thing still showing above the water on the bar's highest point. The rest of it was gone, submerged, reclaimed by the channel it had been borrowed from, returned to the river's accounting. 5 men had been on it. 5 men were now on the east bank. 2 of them were wet through, and 1 of them had a broken leg, and all of them were alive, and the accounting of that was the only accounting that mattered. Gus stood with water running from his flannel shirt and dripping from the brim of his hat, which he had retrieved from the cottonwood branch before crossing, and he turned from the bar and looked at River. He looked at her for a long time. The quality of his looking was different from any way Eli had seen Gus look at anything. It was not the evaluating look of a foreman assessing a piece of equipment. It was not the dismissive look he had used for the first month of Eli's time on the property, the look that said he had already categorized this animal and was not interested in updating the category. It was something else, the look of a man who has spent 20 years building a picture of the world and has just found a piece that does not fit the picture, and who is old enough and honest enough to know that the problem is with the picture and not the piece. He walked to River. He stood beside her, not in front of her, in the position of someone who is not asking anything of an animal, but simply sharing its proximity, and he put one hand flat against her shoulder, the wet shoulder, the shoulder that was still showing the faint dried outline of the high water mark from her crossing. He held his hand there for 5 seconds. Then he looked at Eli and said, "I've spent 20 years on cattle outfits. I've worked horses from Texas to Montana. I've had good horses, and I've had horses that I thought were good and turned out to be adequate." He stopped. He was not a man who made speeches, and he was not making one now. He was making a statement, the kind that costs something, the kind that a man of 20 years of established certainty pays for in a specific currency that does not replenish easily. I've never seen a horse make that decision on its own. With the rope, he took his hand off River's shoulder. "I've been calling her the wrong thing for 2 years. Eli did not say anything. He did not need to, and he knew it. Pete, who had come across on his own rope hand over hand in the interval between Frank's crossing and Gus's because his hip had decided it would rather be wet than watch any longer, was wringing out his hat beside them, and he looked at Gus with the expression of a man who has been waiting a specific number of years to hear a specific thing, and has now heard it, and finds that the hearing is satisfying without being pleasant, because the years of waiting were real, and the thing that was waited for should not have taken so long. Harriet was directing the handling of Frank's leg improvised splinting, a canvas jacket folded into a pad, a rider already gone for the doctor in town before the trough crossing had been completed. She moved through the crisis with the specific efficiency of a woman who has managed emergencies on a working ranch for 3 decades, and has long ago made peace with the fact that emergencies are not exceptional events but a regular feature of the operating environment. and that the appropriate response to them is competent action rather than emotional reaction. She came to where Eli was standing with River, as the light went from gold to orange, and the shadows lengthened across the east benchland toward the mountains. She looked at the bar, which was now only a cottonwood top above brown water. She looked at Frank, who was being tended. She looked at the men who had made the crossing. She did her counting in the particular way she did everything completely, without omission. Then she looked at River, and something in her face shifted by a margin so small that Eli would not have caught it in the first weeks on the property. But he had been watching her long enough now to read the small movements. Shorten her stirrups, she had said before the crossing. Check your knots yourself. She had not said don't go. She had not said the horse isn't capable. She had said the thing a person says when they have made the decision that the risk is worth taking and are moving directly to the preparations that give the risk its best chance. That was the Harriet Calloway. That 3 decades of hard country had built a woman who assessed what was real and moved toward it without the luxury of pretending that the real thing was anything other than what it was. She looked at Eli now with the same assessing directness she had looked at him on the day he arrived. Your horse, she said. Yes, he said. She's tired, yes, Harriet nodded. Bring her in slow, no more water tonight. She looked at the bar one more time. We'll account for the cattle in the morning. She turned toward the east bench and began the walk to the ranch, and the hands who were not managing Frank fell in behind her with the instinctive alignment of people who have found their organizing principle and are moving with it. Eli stayed. He stood with River on the east bank as the last of the day's light moved off the water, and the sounds of the rescue resolved into the sound of the river alone. The river that was still high, still carrying the mountain's rearrangement downstream, still running through the channel it had claimed from the bar. River's head was lower than her working height. Not hanging, she was not a horse that hung her head in defeat, but lower. The posture of genuine tiredness, the posture of an animal that has given the full measure of what it had, and is now in the process of deciding what it has left. Eli put his hand on the side of her neck, in the spot below her good ear where the skin was fine and the pulse was accessible, and felt her heartbeat steady, slower now, returning to its baseline in the reliable way of a body that had not been asked to exceed its capacity, but had been asked once to approach it fully. He thought about Wyoming. Not about the house, or the tack room, or the yellow curtains, or any of the specific objects of that life, but about the feeling of a morning when you knew what the day held and the day held things worth knowing, when the work had weight because the work was pointed at something, when you were not simply moving through time but building something inside it. He had not had that feeling in 11 months. He had had work because he was constitutionally incapable of not having work, but work without that feeling was just motion. And motion without direction was just the management of days until they ended. Standing on the east bank of the Powder River, in the last light of a catastrophic afternoon, with his hand on the neck of a horse that had just done what she had done, he recognized the feeling returning. Not as a wave, not as a sudden reversal of the gray that had followed Wyoming, just as a fact. A quiet, unannounced, reliable fact, the way dawn is a fact rather than an event. The gray did not vanish. It was still there in the background, the memory of everything that was gone. But there was something in front of it now, standing between him and the gray, something that had weight and presence and did not require his grief to be over before it could begin. He did not assign a name to what it was. He was not ready for names. But he felt it, and feeling it after 11 months of not feeling it was enough for now. River lifted her head. Both ears came forward, the good one and the torn one, and she looked east toward the high ground, and the ranch and the warm barn that was at the end of that direction, and she stood with a patience that was not resignation but readiness, the specific readiness of an animal that is tired, and knows the work is finished for today and is waiting, without urgency, for the signal to go home. He took her rein and began to walk. She walked beside him, not behind him, the way she had started walking beside him in the 3rd week at the ranch, not because he had taught her to, and not because the lead rope required it, but because the distance that had existed between them at the beginning had been replaced by something that did not require the performance of distance, and the natural expression of that replacement was to be where he was. The east bench was dark before they reached the high ground. The sounds of the river faded behind them into the general quiet of the Montana evening. The wind in the grass, the distant lowing of cattle that had made it to high ground, and were now processing what had happened in the collective low-level way of herd animals. Above them the sky had gone to the deep blue that preceded full dark, with the first stars appearing at the zenith, and the air was cold with the cold that followed flood weather, sharp and mineral and clean. Gus Dalton was waiting at the top of the rise, not for Eli specifically, or not obviously. For Eli specifically, he was standing with his hat in his hands, looking north toward the river, in the attitude of a man who has come to a high point to look at something and is still looking. But he did not move when Eli and River reached the top of the rise, and the not moving was its own form of waiting. He looked at River for a moment. Then he looked at Eli. Then he looked at his hat, which he was turning in his hands in the slow rotation of someone with an unresolved thought they are working through in the absence of other options. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "I'll be talking to the new men about the string." He turned the hat one more rotation. "I want to change what I've been telling them about how to handle a horse that stops." Eli waited. "I've been telling them it's stubbornness," Gus said, "that the correct response is to push through it." He stopped. He was not a man who found this kind of statement easy to make, not because he was dishonest, but because he had built his professional identity on the authority of his assessments, and revising an assessment of 20 years standing in front of himself and another man was an act that cost something real. "I'm going to tell them it depends on the horse, that there are horses that stop because they won't go, and horses that stop because the ground won't let them, and that learning to tell the difference is part of the work." He put his hat back on. "That's what I'll tell them." He walked east toward the ranch lights. Eli stood at the top of the rise and watched him go and thought about what it costs a man to say the thing Gus had just said, and what it means when a man says it anyway, and decided that both things were considerable. River stood beside him. She was looking south, away from the river, toward nothing in particular, with the loose, unhurried attention of an animal that has concluded the day, and is content to wait for what comes next without requiring that it come immediately. Her torn ear was at rest for the first time since before dawn, not listening to the north, not tracking anything, simply at the angle of a structure that has no current demands on it, the particular stillness of a sense organ that is, for this moment, not needed. The river ran on below them in the dark, doing what rivers do, carrying everything it had taken and moving it somewhere downstream, indifferent to whether the carrying was convenient, relentless in the way that only things without opinion can be relentless. It had taken the bar, and it had taken the near bank at the original crossing, and it had taken 2 barns worth of fence, and it had taken a day's worth of careful plans, and it had taken the certainty out of a foreman who had carried that certainty like a tool for 20 years. What it had not taken was the 5 men who had been on the bar, or the horse that had read the water correctly, or the rope that had held. In the ranch buildings below, lamplight was appearing in windows as the evening settled in the cook fire. The bunkhouse, the main house where Harriet Calloway was already at the table, with the damage ledger open and the lamp turned high, because that was what you did when a day went the way this day had gone. You began the accounting, before the feeling of it could make the numbers harder to face. She would write down what was lost, and she would write down what was found, and the sum of those 2 columns would tell her what the operation looked like on the other side of the flood, and she would make the decisions that the sum required. Eli moved River down the slope toward the barn. She walked with him in the dark without stumbling, placing each foot with the same care she placed every foot on uncertain ground, reading the slope through her hooves the way she read everything quietly, completely, without making a performance of the competence involved. The stars were coming out in number now above the cleared post-storm sky, and the night was cold enough that his breath was visible when it left him, and the barn smell of hay and warm animal reached them when they were still 50 yards out. He unsaddled her in the barn aisle. He did not hurry it. He pulled the saddle with the rope still attached to the horn, and coiled the rope and hung it, and then pulled the blanket and checked her back for soreness. She shifted once when he ran his hand along her left side, but not from pain, from the muscle fatigue of a horse that has worked hard in cold water, and is now in warm air, and is feeling the combination of those 2 things, in the way bodies feel things when the urgency has passed. He dried her with a feed sack, working along her neck and shoulders and belly, and she stood for it with her head at medium height, not dozing but not at full attention, somewhere in the middle register that horses occupy when they are tired enough to rest and safe enough to let themselves. When he brought her grain, she ate with the steady, concentrated focus of a genuinely hungry animal. He sat on the floor of the aisle outside her stall, and listened to her eat and thought about the day, not in sequence but in the way things arrange themselves when you stop trying to order them and let them find their own shape. The mud soft under the crossing, the branch on the rope, River leaning back against the load, Gus's hand on her wet shoulder, the look on Frank Wills's face coming out of the trough, Gus turning his hat at the top of the rise, Harriet saying, "The horse knows the water better than you do. Let her work." He was not a man who had ever thought much about home as a concept separate from the specific physical fact of a home, the house in Wyoming, the tack room, the curtains. He had understood home as a noun, as a thing, as a location on a map. What he was beginning to understand, sitting in a Montana barn in the dark while a small dun mare ate her grain on the other side of a wooden wall, was that home might also function as a verb, that it might be something you did rather than something you had, that it might be constituted, not by the objects that surrounded you, but by the specific quality of attention you brought to the place you were, and the specific nature of what you were paying that attention with. He was paying attention. He had been paying attention for 3 months. And the thing he was paying attention to had been paying attention back. River finished her grain and moved to her water bucket and drank, and when she was done she turned into the stall and stood facing him through the wall with her nose near the partition, and he could hear her breathing in the barn's quiet, and the sound of it was as domestic and reliable as anything he had heard in 11 months, and it was enough. It was, on this particular night, exactly enough. The river took 14 cattle and gave back everything else. Harriet counted on the morning of the second day, when the water had dropped enough to read the east bench without wading. She walked the damage with the ledger under her arm and Pete beside her and wrote down what she saw in the flat, undecorated hand she used for figures: fencing lost, sections of bank collapsed, the timber bridge gone entirely, the alternate crossings gravel bottom rearranged into a configuration that bore no resemblance to what it had been. She wrote all of it, and when she was finished, she closed the ledger and said, "We kept the people." That was the accounting. Everything else was property, and property could be rebuilt from the operating account if the season had been good enough. And the season had been good enough. Frank Wills spent his first week of recovery in the main house, because the bunkhouse steps were not navigable on a splintered leg without help he would not ask for. Harriet moved him without ceremony to the room off the kitchen, the one with the solid table that Aldrich the doctor had used, and Frank accepted this, because Frank was sensible enough to know that there were moments when accepting help was the more efficient choice. He was upright by the 3rd day, moving through the barn on a crutch Pete had shaped from a cottonwood branch, and by the 5th day he had established himself as the organizational authority of the South Barn with the quiet, methodical competence of a man who had found the work his current body could do, and was doing it without commentary. On the 4th day, Frank took down the plank from River's stall. Not announced, not explained. Eli came back from the east bench in the late afternoon. He had been crossing twice daily since the water dropped, reading the new bottom configuration, building the working knowledge of what the flood had left, and the door frame of River's stall was bare wood where the burned-in letters had been. The plank was in the burn pile behind the barn. Frank was in the aisle with saddle soap and a length of harness leather, and he did not look up when Eli came in. Eli looked at the bare frame. He looked at Frank. "Needed to come down," Frank said. Eli unsaddled River and put her in the stall, and that was the end of it. Gus Dalton did not make a speech. He did not call the crew together and deliver a revised philosophy of horsemanship. He did not apologize to River or to Eli or to anyone, because Gus was not a man who processed reckoning through words, and the people who knew him understood this and did not require the words. What he did was change 2 things, and the 2 things were visible to anyone who paid attention, which on the Calloway Ranch meant Pete and Frank and eventually the rest of the crew, in descending order of the speed at which they paid attention to anything. The first change: he stopped carrying the pair of steel roll spurs to the assignment of difficult horses. They had hung on the tack room wall for 11 years, and they stayed on the wall now, and nobody asked why. The implicit instruction they had represented that reluctance in a horse was a problem requiring escalation simply ceased to be offered, and in its absence something shifted in the way the crew approached the horses that needed more than routine handling. The second change was harder to name but easier to see. Gus began spending the first 20 minutes of each morning in the barn before assignments, moving through the stalls without agenda, putting his hands on the animals, not assessing them for work, not checking for soundness or injury, though he noticed those things. Just learning the daily variation of each animal, which one was tight across the back after a cold night, which one was listening to something outside the barn, which one was having a day that warranted a different ask than the day before. He had known how to do this at the beginning of his career, and had let the knowing calcify under 20 years of knowing what he already knew. He was doing it again now with the specific concentration of a man recovering a skill he had allowed to lapse, not performing recovery but simply doing the work of it. The crew noticed. They did not remark on it to Gus's face, because the crew of a working outfit does not remark on such things to the face of the man who runs it. But in the bunkhouse in the evenings there was a shift in the quality of conversation about the horses, more specific, more observational, more interested in what a given animal was doing, rather than whether it was complying. This was Gus's influence operating the way real influence operates, not through declaration but through the daily accumulation of demonstrated attention. 2 summer hands arrived in early June. Brothers from eastern Montana named Dell and Cord Purcell, 22 and 20 years old respectively, built like men who had grown up in physical work and had the specific quality of young men who are skilled enough to be confident, but not yet skilled enough to know the edges of their skill. They rode well. They read cattle competently. They had been told before arriving that the Callaway outfit ran things a particular way, and they had nodded and meant by the nodding that they would comply with whatever rules were stated, which is different from understanding why the rules exist. Gus put them on the string horses for the first week, and watched them the way he watched everything now from the corners, without announcing the watching. On the 8th day he assigned Dell Purcell a horse called Tracker, a gray gelding of 12 years who had the habit of stopping at certain creek crossings in a way that Dell read as stubbornness and responded to with his heel. Gus watched from the fence rail. He watched Dell kick. He watched Tracker plant. He watched Dell reach for the rein end. "Hold," Gus said. One word. Dell looked over. The expression on his face was the expression of a young man who has been interrupted in the middle of what he believed was the correct response to a clear problem. "What does the creek look like?" Gus said. Dell looked at the creek. "Fine," he said. "Looks fine. Get off, look at it." Dell dismounted with the particular economy of someone doing what he's been told while reserving judgment. He walked to the creek edge and looked down into 8 inches of clear running water over what appeared to be a gravel bottom. He looked back at Gus. "Press your boot into the far edge," Gus said, where he was pointed. Dell pressed his boot into the gravel shelf on the far side of the crossing. The shelf gave. Not catastrophically, not the dramatic sinking of the mud pocket Eli had found on the North Trail 3 months earlier, but the give of a bottom that had eroded from below, that would compress and shift under a horse's weight in a way that was unpredictable and therefore dangerous at speed. Dell stood with his boot in the soft edge and looked at it. Gus said, "He knew before you did. Your job was to find out what he knew, not to overrule it." Dell looked at Tracker. Tracker was standing at the creek edge with the particular stillness of an animal that has been waiting for someone to catch up. Eli was 20 yards back, working a different section of fence, and he had been watching the exchange with the peripheral attention of someone who is doing one thing and monitoring another. He saw Dell's face change when his boot went into the soft gravel. He saw the recalibration, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that announces itself, but the small, cellular kind that happens when a piece of information arrives that revises a working assumption. Dell would not forget the feel of that gravel giving under his boot. He would not forget the expression on Tracker's face, patient, waiting. Already arrived at the conclusion Dell was in the process of reaching. Gus did not say anything further. He climbed off the fence rail and walked back toward the barn. That evening, Cord Purcell came to Eli at the fence line he was repairing, and stood for a moment in the way of someone who has a question, but is deciding whether to ask it. He was 20 years old and wore a canvas jacket that had been his brother's first, a mule-ear boot with a cracked left sole that he had wrapped with rawhide in a repair that would hold through the summer. He looked at the fence post Eli was setting and then at River, who was ground-tied 10 feet away. "Dell told me about the creek," Cord said. Eli tamped the earth around the post. He waited. "How do you know?" Cord said. "When the horse is telling you something versus when it's just not wanting to go." Eli straightened. He looked at River, who was standing with her good ear forward and her torn ear at the sideways angle she held. when there was nothing specific to track. You watch long enough, he said. A horse that doesn't want to go looks different from a horse that's telling you something. One of them is looking away from the problem. The other one is looking straight at it. Cord considered this, and if you can't tell, then you stop and look yourself. Eli picked up the wire stretcher. 30 seconds. It costs you 30 seconds to check. The ground that gives way costs you everything. Cord nodded. He went back to his work. Eli returned to the fence and thought about the fact that he had said the thing he said without calculating it, without reaching for the right framing. It had come out already assembled because it had been assembled in him for 3 months by the daily experience of following River's attention across country that punished the inattentive. He was not passing along wisdom. He was reporting what the land had taught him the same way Pete reported what 62 years had taught him, not as lessons but as facts. The simple accumulated truth of having been somewhere long enough to learn what it knew. The summer moved through its work, and the work was the honest, repetitive, physically demanding work of a cattle outfit, in a good year which this was, despite the flood, or perhaps because the flood had torn up the old grass and left room for new growth that was deeper rooted and richer than what it replaced. The east bench recovered faster than Harriet had projected. The scattered cattle came in healthier than they had gone out. The fence line that the flood had taken was rebuilt in sections through June and July, Eli and the Purcell brothers working it systematically, Gus checking the progress and adjusting the plan. When the plan met ground conditions the plan had not accounted for. River worked the summer as she had worked the spring fully, without drama, with the ongoing quality of attention that Eli had stopped noticing as unusual because it had become the baseline of what he expected from a working partner. She found 3 more soft spots in the east bench over the course of the summer, each one in a location that would have been a problem if approached at speed, each one found before anyone was at speed. She was not right every time she stopped twice in August. She stopped at things that turned out to be nothing Eli could identify, and the second time Chess, watching from a distance, said something about oracles and luck that he said in the voice of a man who is no longer certain he believes what he's saying. Eli did not respond. The math across the full summer was not about the 2 stops he couldn't explain. It was about the 3 soft spots he hadn't seen coming. In September, the cattle count came in. Harriet did the numbers with Pete and presented them to the crew without ceremony. One evening after supper, the loss from the flood had been recovered, not entirely but within the margin that the season's calving numbers could absorb. The operation was solvent. It was not prosperous in the way of a year without a flood, but it was sound, and sound was what 30 years of Harriet Calloway's management had made it capable of being even after the kind of spring the year had delivered. She said, "Good work." She meant it as a complete statement. The crew understood that she meant it as a complete statement and received it as such. The following morning she asked Eli to come to the main house. He came after the barn work was done, before the day's assignments began. In the clean flannel he kept for occasions that required something above the daily standard. The table had the ledger on it and 2 documents beside it. Harriet was standing at the window when he came in, looking out at the east bench in the September light, and she turned when she heard the door and indicated the chair across from her with the particular gesture she used that was invitation rather than direction. He sat. She sat across from him and looked at him in the direct, undeferred way she had looked at him the day he arrived. The full assessment, not unkind, not soft, simply honest. She had looked at him that day and decided in 4 minutes friends that he was worth the bed and the wages of a spring season. She was looking at him now with the same quality of attention applied to a different question. "The crossing protocol," she said. "The change I made after the flood." He waited. "I want to make it permanent, not as an emergency measure, as standard operating procedure, year-round for any crossing above 6 inches over baseline." She looked at the window and then back at him. "That means River is part of the working infrastructure of this ranch in a formal sense, not the horse assigned to a hand. An asset with a function." She paused. "I'm also going to need someone to manage the horse program going forward. Pete's hip is ahead of him. I need someone who can receive what he knows and carry it forward." Eli said, "I know." Harriet looked at him. "You know which part?" "Both parts," he said. "Pete's been telling me things since June. The way he tells you things when he's decided you're the one to tell." The expression on Harriet's face shifted by a margin that he had learned. Over 7 months, to read the small interior acknowledgement of a thing she had already known. "He didn't tell me he was doing that," she said. "I don't think he tells you everything." "No," she said. "He doesn't." A pause. "He didn't tell me he'd kept a record of every unusual ground condition river found in her first 2 years here either. I found it in the tack room last week. 17 entries. Located. Describe." She set her hands flat on the table. "Pete has been building the case for that horse since before you arrived. He was waiting for someone to build it with." Eli looked at the 2 documents on the table. The first was a work agreement. Not the seasonal terms he had signed in the spring, a year-round agreement restructured, with a wage and a title that reflected what the job had actually become since May, rather than what it had been when Harriet drafted the original terms. He read the title, Head of Horse and Land Management, Callaway Ranch. He read the wage, he read the terms. He set the first document down and picked up the second. It was a deed. 8 acres in the southeast corner of the range, along the creek that fed the south pasture, where the cottonwoods made a windbreak on the north side, and the ground was well drained and level. Attached to the work agreement for the term of continuous service, converting to his outright ownership after 5 years. He read it twice. He set it down and looked at the table between the 2 documents and thought about what he was holding and what it meant, and whether what it meant was something he was ready to receive. He had come here as a man whose name was not attached to anything, not by choice, but because the thing his name had been attached to had been removed in the specific total way that death removes things, leaving the name floating without anchor, in the way of something that has lost the context that gave it meaning. He had carried the floating name across 400 miles of territory. He had arrived at a gate with a crossrail and no sign, and had been given the worst horse on the property, and had sat on the floor of a stall and waited. His name on a deed. His name in a ledger, permanent rather than seasonal. He looked up. Harriet was watching him with the expression she wore when she was giving someone the time they needed, which meant she was looking slightly past him rather than at him, making the privacy of her inattention available. "I need to think tonight," he said. Harriet looked at him directly. Whatever she had expected, this was not it. She held the direct look for a moment without filling it. "The deed and the agreement," he said. "I want to sleep on them one night." She looked at the documents and then at him. He could see her reading the situation with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, not reacting but assessing, finding the shape of what was actually happening rather than the shape she had anticipated. What was actually happening was that he was not refusing and was not accepting and was asking for the thing he was asking for with a straightforwardness that she recognized, because it was the same straightforwardness she applied to everything. One night, she said. He took the documents and folded them and put them in his vest pocket and stood and thanked her with the particular brevity of a man who means his thanks without needing to elaborate on them. And he left. He did not go to the barn. He went to the South Creek instead, to the 8 acres described in the deed, and he walked it in the September evening light. The cottonwoods along the north edge were beginning their autumn color, not fully gold yet, still green with gold, appearing in the upper branches the way dawn appears in a sky that is still mostly dark. The creek ran clear and low at the end of summer, its voice small and continuous over the stones. The ground was what the deed had described, well drained, level, the specific solidity of land that had been here a long time, without being disrupted by the forces that disrupted other land. He stood in the middle of the 8 acres and looked at the cottonwoods and looked at the creek and looked at the bench rising to the east and felt the ground under his boots. He thought about Wyoming with the clarity he could bring to it now, not the raw, total clarity of February, when thinking about Wyoming had been less like thinking and more like falling, but the clearer, harder clarity of a man who has processed something sufficiently to see its actual dimensions rather than only its worst ones. Wyoming had been real. The loss there had been complete. He was not going to stand in a field in Montana and pretend that the realness and the completeness of that loss were things he had moved past, because a man who pretends he has moved past the irreversible things is a man who has not actually reckoned with them. But he was also standing on 8 acres that someone had offered him in a document with his name on it. Both things were true simultaneously. That was the thing he had been working toward without knowing. He was working toward it, not the replacement of what was gone, but the discovery that true things could coexist in a person without canceling each other, that the weight of one did not require the absence of the other. He could carry Wyoming and stand on 8 Montana acres, and both of those could be real at the same time. He walked the perimeter of the 8 acres in the fading light. He found the highest point, which was in the northwest corner where the ground rose slightly toward the bench, and he stood there and looked out at the ranch, the buildings, the barns, the east pasture where the cattle were moving in the last of the afternoon, the line of the Powder River catchment to the south. He could see, from this elevation, the section of East Bench where the flood had taken the bank. The bank had grown back unevenly, the new growth lower than the old, and you could see the line of it from here, the seam between what had been before and what had grown back since. River was in the near pasture. She was standing at the pasture's south edge with her head up, both ears forward, looking at something in the direction of the creek he had just walked. Not alarmed, the loose, upright attention of an animal that has registered something and is deciding whether it warrants more than a look. He watched her watch whatever she was watching. After a moment she dropped her head and went back to the grass. He had been following her attention for 7 months. He had learned through 7 months of following it that the difference between her alarmed attention and her registering attention was the position of her hind quarters. Alarmed, they were gathered under her. Registering, they were relaxed and level. He had not known this in May. He knew it now with the unthought knowledge of something practiced to the point of automation. What he had learned from her was not a list of behaviors. It was a way of attending the daily discipline of receiving what the ground offered, rather than proceeding from the assumption that you already knew what was there. He had come to the Callaway Range knowing how to work cattle and read weather and shoe horses and do the 100 practical things a working man could do with his hands and his experience. He had not known how to do what she had taught him. There was no word for it in the vocabulary of horsemanship or ranching that was adequate to what it actually was. It was closer to the word listen than any other word in the available vocabulary. He walked back to the barn in the dark. River was in her stall when he came in, eating the evening hay in the solid, concentrated way of an animal at the end of a working day. She looked up when he entered the earshift of recognition and went back to the hay. He stood at the gate and watched her for a while, not needing anything from the watching, just staying in the same space with her, the way he had learned to stay in the same space with difficult things, without requiring them to resolve into something more comfortable. Pete came down the aisle, with his measured gait and his cup, and sat on the stool without comment, which was Pete's way of keeping him company, without intruding on the nature of the evening. After a while Pete said, "She showed up after a flood and stood in a pasture and nobody knew what she'd learned." He drank from the cup. "You showed up after a winter and sat in a stall and nobody knew what you'd learned either." Eli looked at River. "The difference," Pete said, "is that she already knew what she knew. You were still in the process of finding out." He set the cup on his knee. "I think tonight you're finding out." Eli did not answer, because there was nothing to add to the accuracy of what Pete had said, and Pete did not need the addition. He stood at River's gate until she finished her hay and moved to the water bucket and drank, and then settled into the corner of the stall in the resting posture, hip dropped, good ear at medium attention. The barn sounds came in around them, the other horses, shifting and breathing, the wind in the cottonwoods outside, the distant sound of the creek, and Eli let the sounds be what they were, without asking them to signify anything beyond themselves. He was not deciding whether to sign the papers. He had known before he asked for the night that he was going to sign them. What he had needed was not time for the decision, but time for the decision to finish becoming itself. The way water needs time to find the level it was always going to find, not because the outcome was in doubt, but because the process of finding it was part of what made it true. He had been moving toward this since February without knowing he was moving toward it. Since the Gold Strike Saloon on a Tuesday evening and 400 miles south, and a gate with no sign and a stall floor and a dried apple placed on the ground. The 8 acres along the South Creek and the name in the ledger and the title on the work agreement were not the destination. They were the shape the destination had taken when it arrived. The destination had been available to him for some time. He had been arriving at it, step by step, in the specific unhurried way of a man who had learned from a small dun mare that the worthwhile things were not rushed into but approached carefully, with attention, with the willingness to stop and read before committing the full weight. He left the barn and walked to the bunkhouse and slept. In the morning he rose at 4 before the crew, and dressed in the dark flannel and canvas and the vest and the hat, and went to the barn. and did the morning work with River in the particular quiet of the early hour, when the ranch was still in the process of becoming the day. He fed and watered and brushed and cleaned feet and resettled the bit to the position he had found 7 months ago, that kept the pressure away from the damaged side of her mouth. She stood for all of it with the trust of an animal that has no reason to be otherwise. Then he went to the main house. Harriet was already at the table with coffee and the ledger open. She did not look surprised to see him at this hour, because Harriet Calloway did not operate in the register of surprise. She looked up from the ledger and waited. He took the 2 documents from his vest pocket, where he had kept them through the night, and unfolded them, and set them on the table. He picked up the pen she had left beside the ledger. He signed the work agreement first, his name in the place provided, clear and complete, without hesitation because the hesitation was finished. He signed the deed second, his name on a piece of land for the first time since Wyoming, and the signing felt like what it was, not a replacement, not a forgetting, not a resolution of what had been lost, but a true and additional thing, built from different material, in a different country, pointing in a direction that was new rather than restored. He set the pen down. Harriet signed both documents with the efficiency she brought to everything that required her signature. She blotted them. She kept 1 copy of each and slid the other copies across the table to him. She looked at him with the expression she wore when a transaction had been completed to her satisfaction, which was also the expression she wore when she was deciding whether there was anything left to say. There was one thing. "Pete's going to tell you more this winter than he's told anyone in 15 years, she said. "I want you to write it down. Not for him, he won't care. For the ranch, for whoever comes after." She closed the ledger. The knowledge that lives only in one person's head is knowledge on a deadline. Eli folded his copies of the documents. He put them in his vest pocket, beside the certificate of ownership for River, which had been there since the day Harriet had given it to him, the paper soft at the folds from months of being carried. He thought about what Harriet had said about knowledge on a deadline, and thought about Pete's hip and the specific way Pete had been talking to him, since June, urgently unhurried. The way a man talks when he knows he has things to give, and is not certain how long the giving window will remain open. He thought about what it meant to be the person who received that knowledge and carried it forward, and what the carrying forward would eventually require of him, which was to find someone else to give it to when his own time to give it came. The chain of it, the specific human work of making sure that what was learned did not die with the learner. He went back to the barn and found Cord Purcell in the aisle checking his horse's feet before the day's work, which was not something Cord had been doing a month ago, but was something he had started doing after the creek crossing incident with his brother, after Gus had said what Gus had said and the soft gravel had confirmed it. Cord was running his thumb around the inside of the near forehoof, with the focused attention of someone learning to read information through his hands. Eli stopped and watched. Cord found a small stone wedged into the cleft of the hoof, and worked it out with his pick, and held it up and looked at it, and then set it in the aisle and moved to the next hoof. He did not know Eli was watching. He was not performing the work for an audience. He was doing it because he had decided it was worth doing, which was the only condition under which the doing of it would teach him anything real. Eli went on to River's stall and began the second part of the morning work. Outside, the September light was coming up over the east bench in the particular way of autumn mornings, when the air is clear and cold, and the light arrives at an angle that makes the land look considered rather than merely illuminated, every fence post casting a long shadow west, every grass blade catching the light at its tip, the whole surface of the bench reading as a map of its own texture in the raking light. The cottonwoods along the powder were beginning to turn. Not gold yet, but the green of them had changed quality, gone slightly yellow at the edges of the leaves in the way that is the first announcement of what is coming. River stood in the morning light coming through the barn door at the angle that struck the right side of her face, and her good ear was forward, and her torn ear was at the neutral angle, and she was looking at the light the way she looked at things that did not require assessment, simply present in it, receiving it, doing the ongoing work of being a living thing in a world that continued to offer information to those who were paying attention. He had come here with one saddlebag that was not full. He had his name in the ledger now. He had 8 acres along the South Creek. He had a horse whose certificate of ownership was soft at the folds from 7 months of being carried close. He had, Which was the thing he would not have predicted in February, and which was the thing that mattered most? Work that required him completely, not his hands alone, not his experience alone, but the specific quality of attention that he had spent 7 months learning to sustain. The attention that River had taught him was possible, that the land rewarded when you brought it fully and punished when you didn't. Tomorrow the Powder River would need reading again. The gravel bottom it had left after the flood was still settling into its configuration, still presenting variations on each crossing that required fresh assessment. River would walk the bank. She would find the entry point the crossing required. They would go in together and come out together, and then there would be the day after tomorrow, and the day after that, and the winter coming with its own set of information that neither of them had encountered in this country yet. And beyond the winter, the spring and the next flood season, and the ongoing daily work of understanding what the ground was saying before committing the full weight. He was not finished learning what this land knew. He was, for the first time in a year, certain that he was going to be here long enough to learn it. Autumn came to the Callaway Range the way it always came to high Montana, not gradually but decisively, the way a door closes rather than the way a candle dims. One morning in late September, the grass that had been green at the roots was gold all the way down, and the cottonwoods along the Powder went from green to yellow in what felt like a single overnight decision, and the air carried a quality of cold that was different from spring cold, more settled, more committed, carrying in it the advanced knowledge of what was coming rather than the memory of what had just passed. The sky went the particular blue of autumn in the high country, a blue with no warmth in it. A blue that was beautiful in the specific way of things that do not care whether you find them beautiful. Eli had been on the Callaway Ranch for 6 months. The ledger of those months was substantial. 14 animals recovered from flood dispersal. 200 yards of east bench fence rebuilt from materials sourced from the ranch's standing timber and Pete's memory of where the old posts had been before the flooding undermined them. Frank Wills walking again with his particular new gait, back in the saddle by late August, not yet at full capacity, but close enough that the gap between current and full was a matter of weeks rather than months. Gus's 2 new summer hands trained and retained, and by October, indistinguishable from the established crew, in the way that the good young ones always eventually became indistinguishable through the accumulation of enough repetitions that the learned behavior stopped feeling like learning and started feeling like instinct. The summer's work had layered new knowledge onto the knowledge that had come before it. Eli had learned the pastures in the way that a man learns a piece of country when he has spent a full season, reading it not just as geography but as a system, with its own logic and its own patterns, the places where the grass grew deep because of underground water, and the places where it looked good and went dry in July, and the places where cattle went first, and the places they avoided without visible reason. He had learned that River's avoidances were not random, and not random seeming, but were, on examination, always responses to real features of the terrain that he had either missed or not known to look for: a seep that made the ground soft in dry weather, a clay lens that held water below the surface of what looked like solid bench, an old buffalo wallow that had filled with decades of wind-blown soil and read as level ground, but was in fact a depression waiting to become a problem in the first hard rain. He had started looking for what River was looking for before she stopped. Not always successfully, her range of perception was beyond his, regardless of how much he practiced, but often enough that the exercise was producing results, teaching him to read the landscape with a specificity that he had not had when he arrived. He was becoming a student of the country in the way that only sustained, attentive presence could make you, the kind of student who is not reading a text but is living inside it, and therefore getting information from every direction simultaneously. Pete said he was the most useful man on the property. Not to Eli directly. Pete was not a man who said such things directly. He said it to Harriet, in the way he said important things to Harriet, which was quietly, and in the context of a conversation about something else, so that the thing he was really saying arrived without the weight of a formal declaration, and was therefore more likely to settle into the place he intended it to settle. Harriet had told Eli this herself without ceremony, in the same practical register she used for everything. She had said, "Pete tells me you're the most useful man on the property." She had looked at him to see what he would do with it, and he had said, "Pete is generous," and she had said, "Pete is precise," and that had been the extent of it. In the mornings, before the crew was fully moving, Eli and Pete walked the horse barn together. This had developed into its own ritual. The two of them moving through the stalls in the early light, with the specific purpose of knowing each animal before the day's demands began, not assessing them for work capability, but knowing them the way you know something you are responsible for, in the full and particular sense of that word. Pete talked as they moved. He had 62 years of accumulated knowledge about horses and working animals and the land they worked on, and the knowledge was stored in stories rather than in principles, in specific incidents and specific animals and specific pieces of country rather than in general rules. And Eli listened the way you listen, when you understand that what you are hearing is not available anywhere else and will not be available much longer. Pete's hip was worse in October than it had been in September. He did not acknowledge this directly. He never acknowledged it directly. But Eli saw it in the way Pete moved in the cold mornings, the particular care he took with the first dozen steps after sitting still, the way he had started leaving the lower set tasks to Eli without reassigning them explicitly, simply by not moving toward them himself. It was not a dramatic deterioration. It was the slow, cumulative arithmetic of a body that has given a great deal and is running a deficit that it can no longer hide by moving quickly. Eli did the lower tasks. He did them without comment, and without making a performance of doing them, which was the only form of help Pete would have accepted. One morning in early October, Pete sat on the stool at the end of the barn aisle and watched Eli clean River's End hooves and said, "There are things I know about this place that I haven't had anyone to give to." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been waiting for the right person." Eli set down the hoof and moved to the next one. "The East draw floods every 5 years in the spring regardless of winter snowpack," Pete said. "The water comes from a fault in the bench above rather than from the creek, so it's not visible until it's already happening. I know where to watch for the sign of it." He watched Eli work. The black horse in stall 4 has a tendency toward colic in the first cold snap of autumn. He needs his water warmed for the first 2 weeks of cold weather. Nobody writes this down because nobody thinks to write down what they know until they're about to stop knowing it. Eli finished the hooves and stood. "Tell me everything you know," he said. "All of it. Whatever order it comes in." Pete looked at him for a moment, with the eyes of a man who has been waiting for permission, without knowing he was waiting for it. Then he started talking, and he talked for the better part of 2 hours, and Eli listened with the complete attention he had learned from the horse standing beside him. And by the end of the 2 hours, there was an agreement between them that was not spoken but was binding. Eli would receive what Pete knew, and would carry it forward, and would add to it what he learned, and would eventually pass it to someone else when his own time to pass it came. That was the morning Pete decided Eli was permanent, in the deepest sense of the word, not contractual but essential, the kind of permanent that does not depend on papers. The branding work ran through the first 2 weeks of October, the last major seasonal task before the outfit settled into the smaller rhythm of the winter management. 200 head to process, the work requiring the full crew plus the 2 summer hands who had stayed on, a week of long days and the specific organized chaos of the working pen dust and noise, and the smell of burning, and the physical collaboration of men who have learned each other's timing well enough to work in close quarters without collision. River worked the cutting during branding. This was not her designed role. She was not built for cutting the way the quick, light horses were built for it, and Eli had not presented her that way. But in the sorting phase, in the reading of which animal needed to go where, and the positioning required to direct it without drama, she was extraordinary. She read the cattle the way she read everything fully, in real time, without the lag of a horse that is processing rather than responding, and she moved with the contained, unhurried decisiveness of an animal that is always exactly where it needs to be, without ever appearing to hurry to get there. Gus watched her work from the fence rail on the second day of branding. He watched for 20 minutes before saying anything to anyone, which was Gus at his most attentive. Then he turned to the 2 summer hands who were watching from the adjacent rail and said, "You see how she's positioned? 2 lengths to the left of the steer's shoulder. Not behind, not beside, 2 lengths left. That's not luck." He looked at them to make sure they were actually looking. "She's not where the steer is. She's where the steer is going to be in 3 seconds. You learn to think that way about the animal's next position, rather than its current one. You'll work cattle better than you ever have." He turned back to the pen. "The horse figured that out, on her own. You'll have to figure it out consciously, which is harder, but you can. The two hands watched River for the rest of the afternoon. On the final day of branding, as the last animals were processed, and the crew was beginning the cleanup work that closed out a big push-coiling rope, storing equipment, releasing the holding pen, Harriet came to the working area in the canvas apron she wore for all outdoor work, and she walked to the fence rail where Eli was sitting, and she looked at River moving in the near pasture where Eli had turned her out to cool, and she said, "Falls here." Eli agreed that it was. Harriet was quiet in the way she was quiet when she was working towards something at her own pace. Around them, the crew moved through the cleanup in the easy, tired rhythm of men, at the end of a long job that has gone well, talking without urgency, moving without hurry. The October light was low and gold across the benchland, the specific afternoon light of autumn that made even ordinary things look considered. "I had a hand once," Harriet said. "Who came here the way you came here?" After something that made staying somewhere specific feel impossible. She looked at the pasture. He was here for 4 years. He learned the land. He was good at the work. She paused. He left when he felt better, when the thing that drove him here had become manageable enough that he could choose without the choice being made by the thing. She looked at Eli. "I've always thought that was the right reason to leave, when the leaving is chosen rather than required." Eli looked at River in the pasture. She was standing in the gold light with her head at medium height, not grazing, not alert, simply present in the late afternoon in the way she was present in everything fully, without division. "I'm not looking for the door," he said. Harriet nodded. "I know," she said. "I'm telling you it's there if you ever need it. And I'm telling you that if you never need it, I'll be satisfied with that outcome." She pushed off the fence rail. "Come to the house after supper." The papers he had signed in September, the agreement, the deed, River's certificate, had gone soft at the folds from weeks of being carried in his vest pocket, which was where he kept them and where he intended to keep them. He walked across the yard, with 3 folded documents in his vest pocket, and the October night coming down cold and clear around him, the stars in their autumn positions, the Milky Way at the angle it held in October, different from the May angle, the whole sky having rotated through its seasonal shift, while he had been on this property, and had not noticed the rotation, because he had been too busy attending to the ground. He went to the barn. River was in her stall in the night quiet, and she looked up when he came in and registered him with the ear position of recognition, and went back to her hay. He sat on the floor outside the stall in the position of the first day, and listened to her eat and thought about what had just happened in the main house, and what it meant in the context of everything that had happened since February, since the Gold Strike Saloon in Miles City, since the south gate of the Calloway place, since a stall floor and an apple placed on the ground. He was not a man given to dramatic internal monologue. He did not experience his life as a narrative with themes. But sitting on the barn floor in October, he was aware that something had completed itself, not ended, completed, in the way that a thing which has been in the process of becoming finally arrives at what it is. He had come here as a man who was primarily composed of what had been lost. He was not that now. He was still composed of it. It was still part of the composition. But it was no longer the whole structure, it was one element among others. The way a cold river is one element in a landscape that also contains grass and sky, and the patient reading of uncertain ground. Pete came down the barn aisle at his careful pace and sat on his stool. He looked at Eli. He looked at the vest pocket where the documents were folded. He looked at River's stall. He had known what was in the main house this evening, because Harriet had told him, in her practical way, that she was making the arrangement. And Pete had said nothing, because nothing needed to be said about it. 8 acres along the South Creek, Pete said. Yes, Eli said. Pete was quiet for a moment. My father homesteaded in Kansas before I was born. He used to say that land only means something when you're going to be there long enough to learn what the land knows. He turned his cup in his hands. Most people don't stay long enough. They learn what they need and they move on. And the land starts over with the next person, and they learn what they need and they move on. He looked at River through the slats. Occasionally someone stays. And the land gives them things. It doesn't give the ones who are leaving. Because you can't give the deep things to someone who won't be there to receive them. Eli looked at his boots. Then at River. What does she know? He said. The land. What's it still keeping? Pete considered the question with the full weight of 62 years of attention. Everything that happened before you got here, he said. All the floods before this one. All the winters. All the horses that read this ground before River read it. The land keeps all of that, in the shape of things, the shape of the draw, the way the creek bends, the places where the soil is different because something different happened there. He drank the last of what was in his cup. You'll learn some of it in 5 years. More in 10. In 20, you'll know things you can't explain to anyone who hasn't been here as long as you have. He stood and went to his room at the end of the barn, and the conversation was finished. Eli sat for a while longer. The winter would come, and the operation would shift into its winter mode, the reduced crew, the daily feeding rounds, the monitoring of the animals through the cold months, the slower pace that was not inactivity but a different quality of activity, more interior, more about maintenance than expansion. He had not been here through a winter. He did not know what the ranch felt like under snow, how the horses behaved in the cold, what the benchland looked like when the grass was buried, and the creek was iced at the edges, and the sky was the flat white of winter overcast for days at a time. He was going to find out. Not with the specific eagerness of someone anticipating a new experience, but with the settled readiness of experience, and who has committed to the full duration of a thing, and is prepared to receive whatever the duration contains. Winter would have its own information, its own set of things that the land knew, and was willing to give to someone who stayed long enough to receive them. He was staying. River had finished her hay and moved to the corner of the stall where she stood to rest, her hip slightly dropped, her good ear tracking the sounds of the barn in their nighttime register. She was in the posture of an animal that has made itself at home in a place, not the wary, upright posture of a horse in unfamiliar surroundings, but the particular looseness of one that has no need to be vigilant at this hour, in this place, because this place has proved, through sustained experience, to be safe. He looked at the torn ear in the barn's lamplight. It was exactly what it was: old scar tissue, a missing section of cartilage, the permanent evidence of something that had happened before anyone at the Calloway Ranch had known her. It was not going to change. It was not going to heal into something more symmetrical or more conventionally correct. It was part of her permanent configuration, along with the crooked tail and the wide hooves and the scars along her rear pasterns that nobody had put there and nobody had been able to undo. She carried all of it without apology and without drama. In the same way she carried everything else about herself as simple fact, as the honest accounting of what she was, offered plainly to whoever had the patience to receive it. The crew remembered the flood in the way that crews remember the things that have separated before time from after time. It had become a marker in the conversational geography of the outfit before the flood, after the flood, used without thought, the way people use calendar years to locate events. Not because the year itself was significant, but because it was shared, because everyone knew where they were standing when the number was spoken. The flood had become part of the identity of the Calloway outfit, in the way that only shared extremity could produce, the kind of identity that could not be manufactured through ordinary shared experience, but that arrived unbidden, through the specific crucible of a day that had genuinely asked something of everyone present. Ches talked about it most. Ches was 24, and from Colorado, and had the temperament of a man who processes things by narrating them, and the flood had given him material he would be narrating for the rest of his working life. He had been the one to bring the feed trough from the south barn. He had run across the east bench, with 2 other men carrying a pine trough as fast as 3 men can carry a heavy object, and he had been there when it went into the water the first time, and he had been there when River held the rope, and he had been there when Gus came off the trough on the east bank and stood with the water dripping off his hat. He told the story at every opportunity to anyone who had not heard it, and embellished it with the unconscious craft of a natural narrator who understood that the story was better served by clarity than by exaggeration, because the real version was already more than sufficient. Reed had heard the story 7 times and said so. Ches told it an 8th, but the version Ches told was, in its essential facts, accurate. River had found the slow water. River had carried the rope across. River had held the line when the branch hit it, and Eli had stayed on the bar while the sand shrank around them, had stayed with her until she was ready to go, had trusted what she knew about the water enough to let her choose the moment. These were the facts. Ches decorated them with additional facts of his own manufacture, about the size of the flood, about the speed of the current, about how close the last spit of gravel had been to gone when River stepped off. But the center of the story was always accurate. Always River and the rope and the moment on the bar. Always Eli refusing to move without her. Frank told the story differently when he told it. Frank's version was shorter and more precise and left out the decorative elements entirely. And it landed harder for the leaving out, the way a simple factual sentence sometimes hits with more force than an elaborated one. Frank's version was, the mare went in when no other horse on the property would go. She brought the rope across. She held it when it needed holding. And the man who rode her refused to leave her behind when the bar was gone. That was Frank's version. People who heard Chez's version and then Frank's version always said the same thing, which was that they wished they'd been there, and they always meant it. Gus had told the story once. To the two summer hands, on a day in late July, when they had been working a difficult crossing on a creek in the east section, and one of the horses had stopped at the edge. Gus had watched the horse stop. He had watched the rider reach for his heel. He had said, in the flat, undecorated voice of a man delivering a fact, "Let her look." The rider had looked at him. "Let her look," Gus had said again. "She's telling you something. Your job right now is to find out what." The horse had looked at the creek edge for 30 seconds, and then had moved 40 feet upstream and entered at a point where the bank was solid rather than undermined. Gus had watched and then had told them, briefly and without flourish, about River and the flood, about the rope, about the bar. He had not told it as a story about Eli's courage or about River's intelligence. He had told it as a story about what happens when you let the horse tell you what it knows, and what happens when you don't. He had not mentioned his own role in the before version of that lesson. The two hands had understood what was not being said, because they were not unintelligent young men, and Gus Dalton was not a person who required supplementary interpretation. November arrived. The first snow fell on the bench on the third day of the month, light and exploratory, more announcement than commitment an inch, gone by midday. But the temperature behind it did not go back up, and the next snow stayed, and the one after that stayed on top of it, and by the middle of November, the benchland was under 4 inches of packed snow that showed the tracks of everything that crossed it, and held them until the next fall covered them. Eli learned the horses differently in the snow. They moved differently, thought differently, used their senses differently in white conditions, the visual flattening of the landscape that covered its landmarks and made depth judgment harder, the way sound traveled farther in cold, dry air, and how the horses tracked sounds at greater distances as a result. River adapted to the snow with the same methodical assessment she applied to every change in conditions. She tested the packed surface before committing her weight, the same hoof tap and listen that she used on uncertain ground in every season, applied now to the question of whether the snow above was hiding anything worth knowing about the soil below. She found 2 more things that winter that Eli would have missed. The first was a section of ice over a drainage in January, invisible under 6 inches of fresh snow, through which a horse's leg would have punched with predictable results. She stopped, tapped, listened, moved 30 yards to where the ice was thicker and the crossing was safe. Eli marked the location and returned in the spring to find the drainage exactly where River had known it to be, the ice long gone but the soft ground of its margins still showing. The winter gave her 2 tests she passed without ceremony, and Eli recorded both in the notebook Pete had told him to keep, adding them to the 17 entries Pete had made in the years before either of them arrived. The winter was long. It was hard in the specific ways that Montana winters are hard, the cold that does not relent, the short days, the repetitive physical demands of keeping animals alive through sustained extremity, the way the landscape simplifies itself to its structural elements and you live inside those elements for months without the visual relief of color or growth. Eli worked through it without the dissociation he had expected, based on the winter before, the Wyoming winter, the winter that had been the worst winter of his life and had taken everything from him while it was happening. This winter was simply winter, cold and requiring and occasionally beautiful in the austere way of frozen things, and he moved through it in the daily rhythm of the work, and the work held him, and River's morning presence held him, and Pete's morning conversations held him, and the ongoing accumulation of knowledge about the land held him, and when January was the longest it had ever been, he had the work the next morning and the morning after that. That was enough. That had always been enough, when there was enough of it. March came with the quality of return, not warmth yet, but the changed angle of the light that precedes warmth, the lengthening of the days back towards something that felt like their full selves. The snow began to loosen its hold on the bench in the specific way of high country snow that has decided the season is over, pulling back from the south-facing slopes first and leaving the north-facing ones, while the south-facing ones turned to the particular mud of snowmelt that was both the signal of spring and its first difficult gift. River noticed the change before any other horse on the property. She became more alert in the mornings with a kind of alertness that was not anxious but forward-looking, the ear position of an animal that is receiving information about what is coming, rather than responding to what is present. She moved differently on the south slopes, with a renewed deliberateness in her foot placement, as the frozen ground gave way to the saturated ground that the thaw produced, reading the transition with the attention she brought to every change in the Earth's condition. The first crossing of the year at normal water level was in late March. The creek on the east side of the south pasture, low all winter under its ice, now running freely and at a level that required decision about entry point. River walked the bank. She found her place. She stepped in. Eli felt, through the saddle, the familiar information, the certainty of good footing, the reading accomplished, the decision made. He felt it, and he recognized it, and he trusted it in the way he now trusted it. Not by deciding to trust it, but by having trusted it enough times that trusting it had become the default state rather than the chosen state. Default trust. That was what 300 days had built. Not dramatic faith, not the kind that required renewal through conscious commitment. Just the background understanding that this was reliable, and that this had always been reliable, and that this had always been reliable, and that the question of its reliability was no longer worth the attention it would have taken to keep asking. They crossed without incident. On the other side, River stopped. Not with any urgency, not the full attention stop of a warning. The resting stop of a horse that has arrived somewhere and is taking stock of where it is. She stood in the thin March sunlight on the east bank of the creek, and her ears moved through their normal range of attending, and her tail moved once in the wind, and she breathed. Eli sat on her and looked at the country around them, the south pasture opening ahead with the first green of the year, just beginning in the south-facing hollows, the bench rising to the east, the cottonwoods along the creek with the first red gold of new buds in their upper branches. The sky was the pale blue of early spring, not yet the deep blue of summer, a sky still finding its color. The air was cold enough to see your breath, but warm enough to feel the sun on the back of your hands above the gloves. He thought about Wyoming in the way he now thought about Wyoming as a real place, a real time, a real set of losses that were permanent and that he carried forward with him in the honest way of someone who has decided that carrying them honestly is both more respectful to what was lost and more survivable than any alternative. He had not stopped carrying them. He had simply learned to carry them alongside other things, which made the carrying different without making it less. He thought about the certificate in his vest pocket. The deed, the revised agreement, the 8 acres along the South Creek where the cottonwoods made a windbreak and the ground was well drained and the horses went when they were choosing their own location. He thought about what Pete had said, the land gives the deep things to the ones who stay. Spring would bring the river up again. The snowmelt was still weeks away at its peak, and the powder would rise as it always rose, and the crossings would require the same reading they always required. And River would walk the bank and find the slow water, and they would go in together and come out together, and this would happen for the next 5 years, and for the years after that, and it would produce the specific accumulation of knowledge that was the life of someone who had stayed in a place long enough to learn what the place knew. He had counted 43 crossings since the flood. He would stop counting at some point, because the number would become too large to be meaningful as a number. The meaning would live in the texture of the knowledge rather than its quantity. River shifted her weight and turned her head to look at something south, a hawk, probably, working the pasture edge for mice. The kind of bird that River always tracked with mild interest and no alarm. She watched it for a moment and then looked forward again. She was not waiting for permission or instruction. She was simply present in the place she was, alert to its contents. Reading it in the ongoing way she read everything, not with effort but with the continuous, habitual openness of an animal that has never stopped learning what the earth was saying. When he was ready, she would move. He was ready. He pressed with both calves, the softest ask, and River stepped forward into the pasture in the beginning of the new spring, her feet reading the ground as they went, her torn ear and her whole ear both attending, her wide hooves carrying the full weight of what they carried with the steady, unremarkable reliability of something that has never been broken, only misunderstood. The grass was wet and cold and beginning. The mountains to the north held their snow still, but would not hold it much longer. The Powder River ran in its rebuilt banks below the bench, revised by the flood into a new configuration that was already becoming the familiar configuration, already teaching itself to the people who crossed it and the horse who read it, and the land that held the record of every version it had ever been. Eli Bowen rode south through the first spring morning of his second year on the Callaway Range, with the mountains at his back and the work ahead of him and a horse beneath him that knew the difference between ground that would hold and ground that wouldn't, and in the specific, unannounced way of things that arrive when you have finally stopped, requiring them to announce themselves. He was home.